Hey guys, tonight we're travelling way back to a time when sex in India wasn't whispered behind closed doors or censored out of the textbooks. Nope. It was art, it was science, it was divine. We're diving into a world where physical pleasure wasn't considered dirty or shameful, it was actually sacred, like spiritually important. So yes, tonight's journey may just blow your mind, or at least make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient cultures in the bedroom. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive this, not in the modern check your pulse kind of way, but in the how did humanity go from that level of openness to this sort of existential spiral. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and what time it is down in the comments. I always love knowing who's listening in and where. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, the first thing you need to wrap your sleepy little head around is this. In ancient India, sex wasn't just sex. It wasn't just procreation or pleasure. It was part of a larger framework, something deeply interwoven into the spiritual, philosophical, and social DNA of the time. If you ever find yourself reading any of the Dharma Shastras, those ancient legal and ethical codes, or the Vedas, yes, those big old scriptures, you'll see that Kama, meaning desire or pleasure, was actually one of the 4 core goals of human life. Dharma, moral duty, Artha, wealth, Kama, pleasure, and Moksha, liberation. 4 pillars. Kama had a seat at the same table as religious duty and spiritual freedom. Let that sink in. In Western thought, especially the modern Judeo-Christian framework, pleasure, especially sexual pleasure, is often treated with suspicion, like it's the enemy of discipline or devotion. But in ancient Indian thought, pleasure was a part of the journey, a valuable part. Not the main goal, but definitely not something to feel guilty about. In fact, neglecting Kama was seen as throwing your life out of balance. It's not about hedonism though. The ancient Indian sages weren't throwing wild orgies in the forest. Okay, some were, we'll get there. But they were definitely saying, hey, experiencing pleasure is a valid, even necessary part of life. Here's where it gets even spicier. Sex was not just about the body. It was also about the mind and the soul. There was a recognition that intimacy, when done consciously, could be a form of meditation. Not in the airy, light a candle and play whale sounds way we think of today, but in a much deeper, symbolic, transformative way. That's why temples were covered in erotic carvings. That's why kings kept copies of the Kama Sutra next to the Bhagavad Gita. That's why ancient scholars wrote about how timing and emotional state affected your romantic experiences, down to which direction you should face for maximum connection. Quick historical fact to tuck under your pillow tonight. By around 300 CE, scholars like Vatsyayana were already writing detailed manuals on how to be a good lover. Not just physically, but emotionally, socially, and even spiritually. It was serious business. And yes, that name will come up again when we get to the Kama Sutra later. Spoiler, it's not a sex manual the way Western pop culture makes it seem. Now for your quirky tidbit of the night. In some regions, during certain festivals, couples were actually encouraged to make love outdoors, under the stars, to honour the union of Shiva and Parvati. That's right, ritualised outdoor intimacy as a form of worship. Imagine that showing up in your community calendar next to farmer's market and open mic night. But here's where things get chewy. There's scholarly debate about how widespread these attitudes really were. Some historians argue that all this openness was limited to elite classes, Brahmins, royals, the literate few who had access to texts and temples. Others believe that even everyday folks, like farmers and potters, were part of a culture that saw pleasure as part of the cosmic order. After all, those temple carvings aren't just in fancy city shrines, they're scattered across rural India too. Even the way people designed their homes included private spaces for intimacy, suggesting that this wasn't just elite behaviour, it was cultural, widespread. You step deeper into this world, imagining what it might feel like to grow up in a place where your coming of age wasn't marked by awkward silences and euphemisms, but by thoughtful guidance, open discussion, and cultural pride in pleasure. You wouldn't feel like a pervert for being curious. You'd feel like you were stepping into an art form, and you'd be expected to practice that art. Responsibly, respectfully, and with genuine intention. There's something comforting about that, isn't there? Not that everything was perfect. Ancient India had its own set of contradictions, repressions, and hypocrisies, but the baseline, the starting point, was very different from what many of us are taught today. And that's our foundation. Before we peek into temples, flip through ancient sex manuals, or eavesdrop on godly pillow talk, we needed this context. The idea that pleasure, yes, even the steamy kind, is a legitimate part of the human experience. Something to explore, not suppress. Something to honour, not hide. It doesn't mean everything was open and carefree, but it does mean we're stepping into a world that saw intimacy as part of the cosmic dance, not something to be ashamed of. So as you sink into your pillow tonight, just imagine a world where joy, desire, and spirit aren't at war, but part of the same breath, where your pleasure isn't a sin but a song. So let's talk about the Kama Sutra. You know, the book people love to name drop whenever they want to sound worldly or spice things up at a party. Except, most of the time, they get it completely wrong. Because here's the deal, the Kama Sutra isn't a sex manual, not really. At least not the way the modern world imagines it, with 1,000 acrobatic positions and zero context. It's not porn, and it's definitely not ancient 50 Shades. What it is a life philosophy, disguised as a user's guide to pleasure. You start flipping through the original text, probably not in Sanskrit unless you're feeling extra scholarly, and right away it's clear this isn't just about what goes where. Out of the 7 parts of the book, only 1 is about actual sexual technique. Just 1. The rest, it dives deep into what it means to live a balanced, fulfilling life. There's a section on how to dress and smell nice. There's advice on throwing a good party. There's even a breakdown of the kinds of women you might meet and what their interests might be. Sometimes charming, sometimes wildly problematic through today's lens. And yes, there's also that infamous section on positions, but even that is less acrobatics for the bedroom and more, here's how to explore pleasure mindfully, with awareness and control. Vatsyayana, the man behind the Kama Sutra, was a celibate monk, by the way. Let that sink in. This wasn't written by a sex-crazed libertine. This was a philosopher who believed that understanding pleasure was essential for a thoughtful, disciplined life. And he had zero interest in shock value. His goal? Teach people how to live well, ethically, sensually, and wisely. And yes, that included learning how to connect deeply with another human being through touch and intimacy. One of the most fascinating things the Kama Sutra emphasizes is that women are not just passive recipients of desire. Nope, they have preferences, they have moods, they have voices. In fact, Vatsyayana encourages men to listen, to pay attention, and to allow women to lead in certain moments. For something written nearly 2,000 years ago, that's kind of radical. And that brings us to a juicy historical fact. The Kama Sutra wasn't even the only guide of its kind. It was just the most famous. There were other texts like the Anangaranga and the Ratirahasya that built on these ideas, tailored for different regions and tastes. A kind of literary Kama universe, if you will. People took this stuff seriously. It wasn't about titillation, it was education. Respectable, necessary education. Now, let's tuck in a delightful fringe fact for tonight. One section of the Kama Sutra gives advice to men on how to make moaning sounds to enhance the romantic experience. Seriously, it's not just about what you do, it's about how you sound doing it. Because apparently ancient Indians knew that audio stimulation counts too. But this is where scholars get into a tug of war. There's still a debate over how widely read or followed the Kama Sutra really was. Was it just for the elite, the upper crust of society lounging in their perfumed beds, while peasants had to fumble through life without any illustrated guidance? Or was it more like the ancient equivalent of a paperback self-help bestseller, something that spread across regions, whispered from friend to friend, transcribed in dusty monasteries and passed along to those who needed it? Some argue that the Kama Sutra's influence was largely academic and literary, not practical. Others believe its ideas filtered down into daily life, rituals, festivals, even conversation. It's tricky, because we're dealing with a world where most people didn't write things down, and what was written often got lost, burned, or misinterpreted later, especially when colonial powers stepped in and began sanitizing Indian history, erasing anything that looked too sensual. But what we can say, with some confidence, is that the Kama Sutra wasn't a taboo book hidden under floorboards. It was studied, discussed, and included in royal and scholarly libraries. The art of love wasn't kept in the dark. It was lit up, examined, even honoured. In fact, sex was considered so important to social harmony that people were expected to learn about it in order to avoid marital discord and promote happiness in the household. Imagine growing up in a world where this kind of book wasn't banned or giggled at, but read out loud in the equivalent of a family living room. A place where your elders didn't shame your curiosity. They handed you a scroll and said, "Here, study it well, respect it." And somehow, that actually worked better than the weird, fragmented sex ed most people get today. You might be thinking, but weren't people still conservative back then? In some ways, yes. Gender roles were rigid in many castes. Public displays of affection were rare. But within the right context, inside the home, in temple rituals, during festivals, or in the inner court, there was space to explore. And the Kama Sutra helped shape that space. One passage that always jumps out says that sex is to be practiced according to the custom of the country and the condition of the time. That's not dogma, that's flexibility. The idea that sexuality is alive, adaptable, and rooted in mutual understanding. That's a far cry from the frozen moral codes we often associate with ancient societies. So tonight, let this thought lull you into a different kind of dream. What if you lived in a world where your emotional needs, your sensual needs, and your intellectual needs were all given equal weight? Where no part of you had to be exiled in order to be pure, the Kama Sutra isn't a book about sex, it's a book about being whole. Okay, time to step out of the scholarly scrolls and into the divine drama of the gods, because in ancient India, the gods weren't just chilling on clouds with harps, they were passionately in love, deeply entangled, and sometimes scandalously over the top. If you ever thought divine beings had no interest in earthly pleasures, think again. The pantheon of Hindu deities is practically a cosmic soap opera, full of longing glances, thunderous romances, and yes, earth-shaking intimacy. And that's not an exaggeration. Start with Shiva and Parvati, the ultimate power couple. Shiva, the great ascetic yogi of yogis, destroyer of illusion, and Parvati, the goddess of fertility, beauty, and devotion. You might expect their relationship to be full of stoic meditation and polite conversation over herbal tea. Nope. Their union is often described as so intense, so complete, that it literally shakes the fabric of reality. In one popular story, their lovemaking lasts for centuries, causing tremors across the heavens and scaring the living daylights out of the gods. The solution? The gods beg them to tone it down a little so the universe doesn't collapse under the weight of their divine chemistry. This wasn't just spicy storytelling. These myths carried symbolic depth. Shiva and Parvati's union wasn't about lust. It was the merging of opposites, consciousness and energy, stillness and movement, masculine and feminine. Their intimacy was a metaphor for spiritual wholeness. But yeah, also they were really into each other. And they weren't alone. Krishna, that playful, flute-playing avatar of Vishnu, is another key player in the celestial romance department. He had many lovers, most famously Radha. Their love stories are soaked in poetry, music, longing, and flirtation. Unlike Shiva and Parvati's cosmic marriage, Krishna and Radha's relationship often represents unfulfilled desire and divine separation, the pain and sweetness of yearning for union with the divine. But again, it's all wrapped in the language of human love and sensuality, not sanitized, not awkward, just fully human, or rather fully divine and human. There's also Indra, the king of the gods, who had a reputation for being, let's say, enthusiastic. There's one myth where he disguises himself to seduce a mortal woman, and let's just say that did not go well when her husband found out. Indra ended up cursed with 1,000 vaginas all over his body as punishment. Eventually the gods took pity and transformed them into eyes, which is why he's sometimes depicted covered in them. So yeah, ancient India didn't shy away from dramatic consequences either. A historical fact to curl up with. In many regions of India, stories of the gods' romantic adventures weren't kept locked in temples. They were sung aloud by bards, acted out in village plays, or painted onto the walls of homes. The divine wasn't just for priests, it was part of everyday culture. Kids grew up hearing bedtime stories where gods made love, quarrelled, got jealous and reconciled. In other words, intimacy was considered part of the divine order, not something to blush about. Here's a quirky fringe fact. In some folk traditions there are stories of Ganesha, yes, the elephant-headed god, being born from the sweat of Shiva and Parvati's lovemaking. That's right, a literal love child of divine energy. While this isn't part of the mainstream Puranic canon, these stories speak to just how intertwined sex and sacredness were in the mythological imagination. But not everyone agrees on what these stories mean. Scholars still debate. Were these tales metaphorical, symbolic, or just racy entertainment for the ancient masses? Some argue that they're spiritual allegories, representing different aspects of yoga, devotion, or cosmic creation. Others say, sure, symbolism is there, but don't ignore the obvious. Ancient people saw sex as a natural, essential part of life, even for gods. And here's the thing that really changes the tone. These stories didn't exist to shame or restrict. They existed to teach, entertain, and inspire. They modelled different kinds of love, committed, playful, tragic, even chaotic. And they showed that even the gods struggled with love's complexities. No one was above it. Not even Vishnu, who once turned into the enchanting Mohini to beguile demons and gods. The ultimate gender bender, seducing with purpose, compassion, and, well, flawless hair. As you nestle deeper into your pillow tonight, picture a world where stories of gods being vulnerable, seductive, and open about desire are considered spiritual learning tools. Imagine bedtime tales that didn't separate the sacred from the sensual, where the path to enlightenment wasn't through denial, but through understanding, connection, and ecstatic union, divine or otherwise. And while we're being honest, doesn't it feel a little comforting to know that even cosmic forces fumble their way through relationships just like us? That even gods get jealous, make bad choices, and fall head over heels? So yeah, sex among the gods wasn't taboo. It was part of the blueprint, a metaphor for balance, a tool for creation, a lesson in humility. And when the heavens themselves are shaking from passion, well, it kind of makes that awkward text you sent at 2 a.m. last weekend feel a little less embarrassing. Alright, now we wade into the mysterious, misunderstood, and endlessly exoticized world of Tantra. You've heard the word, probably misused a dozen times. Maybe you've seen it on a spa menu or whispered reverently in a yoga class. Tantric massage, tantric breathing, or the classic, tantric sex that lasts 7 hours. But forget everything you think you know. The real Tantra isn't just about sex, and ironically, it's also not especially easy to talk about in one sentence. It's complex, it's vast, and yeah, there's some steamy stuff, but that's just a tiny slice of the cake. You begin with a candlelit room. You're sitting cross-legged across from a partner. There's no moody music playing, no rose petals on the floor. Just breath, just focus, just the awareness of energy, your own and theirs, flowing and pulsing between two human beings who are more than just bodies. This is closer to what real Tantra was aiming for. Not performance, but presence. Not conquest, but connection. Tantra, in its broadest definition, is a school of spiritual thought that emerged around the 5th to 9th centuries CE, blossoming across both Hindu and Buddhist traditions. It literally means loom, or weaving, which is perfect, because it weaves together the physical and the spiritual, the sacred and the sensual, the worldly and the transcendent. It doesn't see life as something to escape from. It sees life as the very path to liberation. And yes, everything in life, including sex. A historical gem for you tonight. In some tantric schools, sexual union between practitioners wasn't just symbolic, it was literal. But it wasn't an orgy in the woods, it was ritual, carefully choreographed, guided by mantras, breath control, visualization, and above all, discipline. The goal wasn't orgasm, it was transformation. A way to channel the body's most primal force, sexual energy, into spiritual awakening, to light up the body's subtle energies, open dormant chakras, and basically ride the cosmic wave to enlightenment. But here's where things get really interesting. Not all tantric paths involved sex at all. In fact, many were completely celibate. So that part of Tantra you've seen, wrapped up in sensual imagery and glossy magazines, that's only a tiny fringe corner of the tradition, one that happened to be the easiest to sensationalize. Western explorers and colonial scholars got their hands on a few of these texts, often taken out of context, and just ran with the raciest bits. It's like if someone read one steamy chapter of a 7-volume philosophy set and said, "Aha, it's all about orgies and candles." Now for the fringe fact of the night. Certain tantric sects deliberately practiced rituals in cremation grounds. That's right, actual burning ghats, at night, with skulls and all. Why? Because they believed liberation meant facing everything we fear and reject: death, impurity, desire, and reclaiming power from them. Nothing was off limits. Everything had spiritual potential, even the most taboo. And here comes the scholarly brawl. There's endless debate about how widespread these sexual tantric practices were. Were they only performed by isolated sects like the Cowlus and Agoris, or were they integrated into broader society? Some argue these rituals were so secretive and so symbolic that we can't know how often they were literally practiced. Others say, no, there were entire temples, whole communities where sacred sexuality was embraced. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Tantra was never one thing. It was many things, layered like a spiritual lasagna. But here's what's clear. In tantric thought, the body wasn't an obstacle. It was a tool. The senses weren't distractions. They were gateways. Even pleasure wasn't sinful. It was a way of tapping into the divine if handled with consciousness and restraint. Tantra flips the moral script completely. Instead of saying, "Deny the body to reach spirit," it whispers, "Know the body deeply, so you may rise beyond it." Kind of refreshing, right? You settle into that thought. Imagine a world where your most basic urges aren't something to suppress or be ashamed of, but something to understand and guide. Where even the act of making love could be a sacred ritual, not rushed, not mechanical, not shame-soaked, but reverent, embodied, holy. And no, real tantric sex wasn't 7 hours long. It was timeless. Because the point wasn't stamina, it was presence. Being so fully in the moment that time just melts. You're not trying to reach a climax, you're trying to dissolve the ego. Become one with your partner, with the universe, with the god and goddess within both of you. But don't mistake this for romanticism. Real tantra is hard. It demands control, devotion, precision. It's not a free pass to indulge, it's a high-wire act of awareness, which is why not everyone walked this path. It was risky, dangerous even, not just socially, since a lot of it defied caste and purity norms, but spiritually. One wrong step and you could fall into obsession, ego, or worse, delusion. Still, the legacy of Tantra runs deep in India. Its vocabulary, chakras, kundalini, prana, has seeped into yoga, Ayurveda, and modern pop spirituality. But its deeper message often gets lost, that every part of your experience, including sex, is a thread in the sacred weave of life. So as you drift off tonight, try holding on to that idea. Your body is not the enemy. Your desires aren't shameful. They're part of the story. And sometimes, the holiest thing you can do is feel, with your whole being, fully present, without apology. Now let's go for a walk, barefoot, if you like, through the courtyards of ancient temples. The sun's warm on your shoulders, the stone beneath your feet is hot, and up ahead, the walls of the temple rise like a mountain carved from stories. Except this mountain isn't just etched with gods and lotuses, it's covered, absolutely draped, in stone carvings of people mid-embrace, mouths touching, limbs entangled, hips tilted just so. Welcome to Khajuraho. At first glance, you might think, okay, this must have been the world's most open-minded brothel, but it's not. These aren't seedy doodles tucked in the margins. They're grand, explicit, and right out in the open on the temple walls. Men and women, groups of 3, 4, sometimes more, all frozen mid-motion in the heat of desire, and not hidden around back either. They're often prominently displayed, mingled among the gods and celestial beings. Which raises the question, why would anyone carve this much sex onto a holy structure? That's where things get fascinating. Because these temples, especially the famous ones in Khajuraho, Konark and Bhubaneswar, weren't just houses of worship. They were cosmic maps, symbolic blueprints of the human journey. And according to some interpretations, the outer walls of the temples represent the worldly path, the domain of karma, desire, while the inner sanctum represents moksha, or spiritual liberation, So to reach the divine centre, you must first acknowledge, explore, and pass through desire. Not ignore it, not pretend it doesn't exist, but integrate it, face first and full body. And this wasn't just symbolic art, it was also education. Many people couldn't read, but they could learn by looking. These carvings were lessons, visual Kama Sutras, sensual allegories, emotional anatomy in stone. They taught balance, touch, rhythm, roles, and reverence. And yes, they made people blush, even back then. Here's a handy historical fact. The temples of Khajuraho were built between 950 and 1050 CE by the Chandala dynasty. That's nearly 1,000 years ago. And out of 85 temples originally built, about 25 still stand, each one an architectural love letter to life itself in all its forms. Contrary to modern belief, these temples weren't dedicated exclusively to sex. The erotic sculptures only make up a small percentage of the carvings. Most show gods, musicians, animals, dancers, everyday life. But it's the erotic panels that get the headlines, for good reason. And now for your favourite quirky fact. One of the carvings at the Sun Temple in Konark features a couple mid-act, with a peacock watching them from the corner, head cocked like a nosy auntie. It's hard to say if it was meant to be symbolic or just a bold artistic flex, but either way it's proof that these weren't sterile, humorless depictions. There was life and cheekiness carved into that stone. But, and you knew this was coming, there's a heated debate about what these carvings really mean. Some historians argue that they were didactic, showing moral and carnal lessons to temple-goers. Others suggest they were ritualistic, representing actual rites that occurred within or around the temple spaces. There are even theories that these temples were part of tantric traditions, serving both as places of worship and centres for sacred sexuality. On the flip side, some modern scholars downplay the sex entirely, insisting it was more about fertility symbolism or just a reflection of life in all its glory. Either way, they're definitely not just decoration. The positioning, the rhythm, the emotion, it's all too intentional, too intimate to be accidental. You don't spend years carving human figures mid-climax just for the vibes. This was about making a statement, that the divine isn't apart from the physical, that ecstasy can be sacred, that love, in all its forms, tender, wild, queer, plural, is part of the path to transcendence. And honestly, when you stand before one of these temples in real life, or even imagine it from your pillow, you can feel that message. It's not dirty, it's not vulgar, it's powerful. There's something awe-inspiring about how unashamed these ancient creators were. They didn't need to censor the human body to honour the gods. They carved both into the same walls. Picture a young couple from a nearby village walking barefoot to the temple for the first time. They look up, see these carvings, and maybe laugh a little, maybe blush, but maybe too they see something familiar, a reflection of their own curiosity, their own longing, and maybe, without a single word spoken, they learn something important, that pleasure isn't something to hide, that the human body isn't a source of shame, but a miracle worthy of celebration. It's wild how far we've drifted from that perspective. Over time, many of these carvings were defaced, hidden, or explained away. Colonial-era scholars described them as primitive, or obscene, trying to fold India into Victorian moral standards. The spiritual dimension was erased, the nuance flattened, and what was once sacred became scandalous. But the stone doesn't lie, it's still there, waiting. Covered in dust and time, yes, but still humming with the energy of a civilization that once saw sex as something holy, worth carving into eternity. So tonight, as you drift into dreams, picture the temple walls lit by the golden edge of sunrise. See the lovers forever mid-motion, frozen not in shame but in joy. And imagine that somewhere, in the quiet of your own being, there's a temple just like that, where desire and spirit are not enemies, but partners in the dance. Let's leave the temples behind for a moment and step into something quieter, more everyday, the humble, flickering space of an ancient Indian home. No golden arches or sacred fire altars here, just a mud brick courtyard, maybe shaded by a neem tree, birds chirping lazily overhead. It's about 300 BCE. You're reclining on a low woven bed called a charpai, the heat of the day finally cooling, and your partner is beside you, their silhouette outlined by firelight. This is where real intimacy happened. Not in manuals or temples, but in rooms just like this one. So what did sex actually look like on an average night in ancient India? First, forget the idea that life was hypersexual all the time. Daily existence involved grinding grains, fetching water, dodging floods, praying, gossiping, raising kids, and negotiating dowries. People were tired, but pleasure was still part of the rhythm. It was built into the flow of domestic life, not an afterthought or indulgence, but a necessary breath in the daily grind. Married couples were encouraged to enjoy physical intimacy regularly. It was considered not just acceptable but beneficial. The ancient Ayurvedic texts actually recommend frequency, within reason, for good health. Too much, you drain your ovyas or life energy. Too little, you risk stagnation, frustration, imbalance. The trick was moderation, timed with the moon, the seasons, and, weirdly enough, the wind. In fact, certain nights were more auspicious than others. Some days of the week were seen as unlucky for lovemaking, usually Tuesdays and Saturdays, depending on regional customs. The lunar calendar also played a role. Full moons were often favoured for passion, while new moons were more about rest or spiritual focus. Imagine having to check a moon chart before you hop into bed. Actually, with astrology playing such a big role, some couples probably did. Let's toss in a historical fact you didn't know you needed. Ancient Indian households often included small shrines to fertility deities like Kamadeva, the god of love. His bow was strung with sugarcane, and his arrows were tipped with flowers, mango blossom, jasmine, blue lotus. He didn't shoot to wound, he shot to stir desire. Couples might offer prayers to Kamadeva before intimacy, not to get wild, but to stay connected. Romantic compatibility was a spiritual concern. What about the setup? Bedrooms weren't exactly private soundproof sanctuaries. Extended families lived close together. Privacy was precious, and, honestly, kind of rare. Intimacy often happened late at night, behind light cotton curtains under mosquito nets, or in the quiet pre-dawn hours. Some wealthier homes had inner chambers, more secluded and cool, with sandalwood-scented oils, embroidered linens, and metal or terracotta oil lamps casting flickering shadows. There might even be a bronze mirror tucked in a corner, or a little vial of rose water near the bed. Fringe fact of the night. Certain lovers in ancient India believed that chewing betel leaves together before intimacy helped sweeten the breath and the mood. Picture that, you and your partner, passing a spicy, tangy leaf back and forth, your mouths already tingling before anything else even begins. It wasn't just about taste, it was ritual, a sensual starter course. And while this might all sound idyllic, real life had its awkward moments too. People got nervous, clumsy, mismatched in desire. That's why there were love advisors. Not therapists exactly, but older women, courtesans, or even family friends who might offer tips, spells, and homemade aphrodisiacs to help things along. The idea wasn't that sex had to be perfect, but that it was worth putting effort into. It wasn't just biology, it was craftsmanship. Here's where things get a little thorny. Scholars are divided on whether the open-minded attitudes reflected in sacred texts and temple art filtered all the way down to the rural or working classes. Some argue that most of the sophisticated attitudes about intimacy were confined to elites, poets, priests, royalty. Others say that while the specifics might have varied, the general sense of sex as a natural and valued part of life extended across classes. After all, human desire doesn't check your birth certificate. Even regional folk songs hint at this more relaxed approach. Many are filled with double meanings, cheeky metaphors, and blushing jokes. One might describe a woman drawing water from the well in a way that's clearly not about hydration. These songs were sung out loud during festivals, weddings, harvests, ritualized moments where the boundaries loosened and things got a little saucy. In those lyrics, you catch echoes of an older, more playful relationship with sexuality, one that didn't flinch. Back in your imaginary courtyard, you and your partner shift under a thin cotton sheet. Outside, the frogs begin their nighttime chorus. Inside, your fingers touch in the dark. There's no Kama Sutra diagram hanging on the wall, but there's familiarity, patience, maybe even a whispered joke. Maybe you say something about Kamadeva's flower arrows and both of you chuckle, and then, breath by breath, the moment unfolds. Not like a performance, but like a dance you've been practicing your whole life. And this is what often gets missed when we talk about ancient sex. We fixate on the wild, the ritualized, the forbidden, but most of it was gentle, rhythmic, intimate in the truest sense. It was a way to soften the harsh edges of daily life, to reconnect after long hours apart, to re-anchor the body in something kind. And for a culture that believed in reincarnation, karma, and cosmic rhythm, that moment between two lovers wasn't just private. It was sacred, echoing through lifetimes. So tonight, as your body melts into your mattress and your breath slows, imagine that quiet room. Not the textbook, not the temple, the home, where bodies knew each other by touch, not theory. Where desire didn't need permission, it was just another part of living. All right, so we've peeked into the temples, listened in on the gods, and snuck under the covers of daily life. But let's talk about how people learned about any of this in the first place. Spoiler, nobody was born knowing which flowers Kamadeva favoured or what nights to avoid sex unless they were ready for a lifetime of bad luck. In ancient India, sex education wasn't some rushed school slideshow with diagrams and forced eye contact. It was a slow drip of knowledge, given through stories, songs, scrolls, and sometimes a very frank old auntie with no filter. Picture this. You're around 15, your voice just starting to crack or your sari tied a little differently. You've started getting the look from the neighbours, and your parents are whispering more than usual. One morning you're called aside. It's not a birds and bees talk exactly. It's more like, here's how to be a good human, and also a good lover eventually. If you're lucky, you get guidance from someone who knows what they're talking about. If you're really lucky, someone hands you a scroll. One of the earliest structured approaches to sexual education came from the Kama Sutra tradition. Yes, the same world that gave us the Kama Sutra, but much broader. These weren't just sex guides, they were manuals for life, teaching everything from courtship to conversation to, well, ideal bedroom choreography. Some were written as dialogues between a teacher and student, a clever trick to make the material feel intimate and wise. Here, young one, the teacher might say, this is how you make someone feel seen. This is how you touch. This is when to stop. And don't think this was limited to men. Ancient texts like the Rahasya were often written specifically for or about women, sometimes from a woman's perspective. Women learned too, sometimes through private instruction, other times through temple schools, family matriarchs, or even courtesans who passed their wisdom on like heirlooms. These weren't lecture halls, but shared spaces, bathhouses, kitchens, festival gatherings, where the body and its mysteries could be discussed without shame. Historical fact to note tonight. Education about sex in ancient India was often holistic. It included emotional dynamics, astrology, hygiene, clothing, fragrance, and even voice tone. It wasn't just about physical technique, it was about timing, context, and inner poise. Imagine being taught that eye contact matters more than speed, that your scent could shift the mood, that knowing a raga or love poem could be just as seductive as any physical move. Now for your fringe fact, some texts outlined how to gauge a potential lover's personality by their favourite colour or how they walked. Yes, actual advice like, if they walk like a swan and favour pale fabrics, they are gentle and slow in bed. Ancient Indian tinder was basically an astrologer's scroll, a sandalwood perfume, and the ability to read someone's gait from across the room. But not everyone agreed on how, or even if, this kind of education should be shared. Scholars still argue whether these teachings were widespread or reserved for elite circles. Some believe that this bedroom literacy was mostly for royalty and upper caste families, people with the leisure and resources to study love as an art form. Others insist the knowledge trickled down in oral tradition, folk songs, temple dances, storytelling nights under banyan trees. Because even if you couldn't read Sanskrit, you could still learn how to touch someone kindly. Knowledge doesn't need ink to spread. And then there were the gurus, spiritual teachers who might weave lessons about love and pleasure into broader life training. While most think of gurus as celibate ascetics, some belong to tantric or bhakti traditions that embrace the body as a spiritual instrument. They might teach that lovemaking, when done mindfully, was a kind of yoga. Not a physical exercise, but a union of souls, breath, and intention. Let's not forget the professional educators of love, the courtesans. In some cities, Courtesans were highly trained in the art of conversation, music, poetry, and, yes, pleasure. Their salons were places of learning, not just entertainment. Young nobles were often sent to courtesans to learn how to charm, respect, and satisfy a partner. And these women weren't just pretty faces, they were poets, philosophers, and sometimes political influencers. If you really wanted a masterclass in karma, you didn't go to a dusty scroll, you went to her. Of course, this openness was still shaped by caste, gender roles, and social status. Education wasn't handed out equally. Many rural or lower caste communities passed down knowledge differently, through rituals, through observation, through whispered advice before a wedding night. Sometimes it was tender, sometimes clumsy, sometimes wrong. Because let's be real, no society is free from awkwardness. But the big takeaway? In ancient India, sex education wasn't seen as dangerous. It wasn't locked away or drowned in shame. It was part of preparing for adult life. Like learning how to cook rice or sweep a courtyard, it deserved attention, it deserved respect. And above all, it deserved to be taught, not buried under embarrassment. So now, as your mind floats between half dream and half memory, imagine learning about pleasure from someone who actually cared. Someone who believed it was their duty to teach you how to love well, touch gently, and walk through desire without fear. Imagine a world where that wasn't awkward, but natural. And maybe, just maybe, it's not such a foreign idea. Maybe the whispering banyan trees and sandalwood-scented lessons are still waiting, tucked somewhere in your own memory, ready to return. Now, let's rewind to something a little less seductive, but a whole lot more complicated: rules. Because for all the sensual celebration and open-mindedness we've explored so far, ancient India also had a deeply structured view of who could have sex, when, how, and with whom. That might sound like a total buzzkill, but hang tight. It's more nuanced than just a list of do's and don'ts. You're stepping into a world that held pleasure as sacred, but expected you to approach it like a well-rehearsed ritual, precise, respectful, and very aware of your place in the social order. First things first. Age. People definitely married younger in ancient times, but that didn't mean everything started at puberty. While the marriage age varied wildly by region and caste, actual sexual relations were often delayed until physical maturity. Texts like the Manusmriti, that famously rigid legal code, laid out clear timelines. Boys were expected to complete their student phase, known as brahmacharya, before marrying. That could mean years of celibacy, studying, and rituals before any karma was even on the table. And for girls, ideally they'd marry after reaching puberty, though again, interpretations and practices varied. For royalty and higher castes, marriages were often arranged early, but consummation was sometimes delayed, at least officially. Now, caste played a huge role. The higher your caste, the stricter your bedroom rules. Brahmins, for example, were expected to marry within their varna and adhere to spiritual purity, which included regulating when and how sex occurred. Some castes had specific days deemed unsuitable for intimacy, usually tied to religious fasting days or astrological taboos. Meanwhile, lower castes often had more relaxed practices, though that didn't mean more freedom, just different customs. And let's not forget gender expectations. Men were usually given more leeway, especially in polygamous households. Women, on the other hand, were tightly wrapped in layers of duty, modesty, and obedience. That doesn't mean women didn't enjoy sex or have agency. Many ancient texts openly acknowledge female desire, but within the frame of marriage, fertility, and social stability. A woman's sexual freedom was tied to her status, her husband's mood, and sometimes her moon cycle. Speaking of which, menstruation was a major factor. In most traditions, women were expected to abstain from sex during their period, and often even lived separately for those few days. It wasn't seen as dirty in the Western sense, but more as a time of spiritual pause, when a woman's energy was turned inward. Some traditions believed her energy was too powerful during menstruation for everyday interactions. Others used the time for rest and retreat. But no matter the belief, sex during menstruation was almost always off limits. Now let's drop in a historical fact that's oddly specific. Certain texts, like the Anangaranga, actually recommend which sexual positions were best for different days of the week and seasons of the year. Tuesday? Not great. Friday under a full moon in spring? go for it. They believed that your mood, your health, and even your partner's temperament were all influenced by the cosmic clock. There were even ideal days for conceiving boys versus girls. It wasn't just superstition, it was early biorhythm theory wrapped in astrology and cultural logic. Fringe fact time, there were instructions in some manuals that said if you accidentally had sex at an inauspicious time, say during an eclipse, you should immediately perform purification rituals, which might involve a cold bath, chanting mantras, and offering milk to the household gods. So yes, even back then there was some version of whoops, let's fix that before karma notices. All of this raises a major debate. Were these rules widely followed or just idealized in texts? Some scholars argue that most people didn't live by these codes strictly, that daily survival often trumped astrology. Others believe that these rules deeply shape behaviour, especially among the upper classes where honour, lineage and ritual purity were everything. One thing's clear, sex in ancient India wasn't a free-for-all. It was a layered dance between freedom and restriction, pleasure and propriety. And yet, what's surprising is how these restrictions often acknowledged pleasure rather than denying it. For example, instead of just saying, don't do it on Tuesdays, some texts explained why, linking it to planetary energy, body constitution, or spiritual clarity. It wasn't don't enjoy, it was enjoy wisely. Another layer, consent. While the idea of enthusiastic consent as we know it today wasn't articulated in ancient texts, many works do reference the importance of mutual enjoyment. The Kama Sutra warns against pressuring a partner and praises the art of gradual seduction and attentive listening. If a partner showed disinterest, the act was meant to pause. That might not be a perfect modern ideal, but for its time, it was progressive. You can imagine a married couple lying side by side, planning their evening with as much attention to lunar cycles and temple schedules as to their own bodies. Maybe they've just come back from a festival, incense still clinging to their clothes, and now they pause. Is tonight a good night? Has she finished her monthly fast? Has he eaten too much ghee? Is it Friday yet? In some ways, these layers of tradition created a rhythm to sexuality that was more mindful, more connected to time and nature. It wasn't about urgency or spontaneity as much as alignment. Pleasure wasn't just allowed, it was curated. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of planning. Courtesans, widows, servants, they lived under different rules, sometimes more flexible, often more exploitative. For them, navigating the sexual landscape meant balancing survival, secrecy, and sometimes subtle rebellion. We'll get to their stories soon. But for now, as your thoughts slow and your body sinks into the bed, imagine a world where desire didn't just knock you off your feet. It waited patiently for the right moon, the right hour, the right breath. Where intimacy wasn't rushed, but ritually invited. And in that rhythm there's something calming, a reminder that timing can be sacred, that waiting can be part of the magic, and that pleasure, when welcomed with care, has its own kind of divine clockwork. Tonight, we walk away from calendars and cast charts and straight into a space far more fluid, complex and, honestly, refreshing: gender. Because while modern conversations love to frame gender as this rigid binary thing, ancient India was way ahead of the curve. You see, long before the West even imagined terms like non-binary or genderqueer, Indian society had already carved out space for people who didn't fit neatly into male or female roles. And we're not just talking side characters here, we're talking full-fledged social identities, some even sacred, with their own myths, rituals, and spaces in society. So buckle up, because tonight we meet the Hijras. The term Hijra today refers to a diverse community of people assigned male at birth who identify as female, non-binary, or somewhere in between. In ancient times, Hijras weren't just tolerated, they were often respected, even revered. Think royal courts, temple ceremonies, and public blessings. In many regions they held semi-official roles: musicians, dancers, spiritual guides, and yes, sexual beings, with their own relationships, desires, and rituals. Let's start with a historical gem. During the Mughal Empire, Hijras, then known by Persian terms like Khajuraho, often served as advisors, guards, and confidants in royal harems. They weren't just ornamental, they held real power, both political and personal. Their non-binary status was seen as uniquely trustworthy in spaces divided by strict gender lines. And while that was slightly later in India's timeline, similar roles existed centuries earlier. Even in Vedic texts and Sanskrit literature, we find mentions of people whose gender or sexual identity didn't conform, and instead of being erased, they were given names, stories, even divine lineage. Which brings us to our divine detour of the night, Ardhanarishvara. This is the composite deity who is half Shiva, half Parvati, literally one side male, one side female, the ultimate icon of gender unity, half matted dreadlocks, half flowing hair, one breast, one flat chest, one side soft, one strong. Ardhanarishvara wasn't seen as weird or threatening. This figure was holy, beautiful and balanced, a visual metaphor for wholeness. In other words, ancient India's gods already figured out that gender didn't need to be a war, it could be a dance. And here's your fringe fact for the night. Some old Sanskrit medical texts actually describe the third nature, a category beyond male or female. These weren't always flattering descriptions, there was a lot of nervous energy around sexual deviance, even back then, but the recognition of gender diversity existed. Words like Tritiya Prakriti, third nature, show up in classical works like the Kama Sutra, which doesn't just acknowledge male-male intimacy, but actually includes tips for it. Vatsyayana even classifies a type of lover called the kleber, a word used for men who preferred other men, or for people who didn't align with conventional masculinity. Now, how this all translated into daily life, that's where it gets fuzzy. Scholars debate whether ancient Indian society was truly accepting, or just tolerant in a structured, compartmentalized way. Some argue that non-binary or queer individuals were accepted only in ritual or artistic contexts, blessed when dancing at a festival, but shunned at the dinner table. Others believe that gender fluidity was woven more deeply into the cultural fabric, especially in rural areas where hijras lived communally, participated in religious rites, and blessed newborns and weddings. And the tension is real, because while ancient texts like the Mahabharata feature gender-fluid characters, hello, Shikhandi and Arjuna's one-night transformation, those same texts sometimes view such transformations as divine anomalies rather than everyday possibilities. Was gender fluidity divine, or was it taboo? That depends on which chapter you open, and who you ask. Still, there's no denying that hijras and other third-gender individuals had their own social roles. They often formed tight-knit communities, living semi-independently and passing down traditions orally. In some areas, they practiced their own versions of Tantra. In others, they performed erotic dances or fertility rituals believed to bring luck and ward off evil. And yes, some earned income through sex work, though that part, like today, was shaped more by poverty and social exclusion than identity. You might be wondering, what did relationships look like in these communities? And here's the beautiful, messy answer: everything. Some hijras had romantic partners, men who loved and lived with them. Some relationships were transactional, others deeply emotional. Some hijras rejected all intimacy, seeing themselves as spiritually focused, while others embraced their sensuality. There was no single template. Just like now, their experiences ran the full spectrum of human love and longing. Imagine being in a small village in 600 CE, hearing the distant beat of drums as a hijra procession winds its way through dusty streets. The children run to watch, giggling. The women come out with rice flour offerings. There's laughter, music, maybe even some flirtation. In that moment, no one's asking questions about chromosomes or identity politics. The hijras are part of the rhythm of life, blessed and feared, respected and joked about, but undeniably present. And as with everything in ancient India, this inclusion wasn't perfect. There were limits, prejudices, unequal protections, but there was space in myth, in ritual, in society. And that space mattered. It told people, you exist, we see you. So as you settle deeper under your blanket tonight, let that thought float in. There was once a world where gender didn't come with a two-option checkbox, where gods blurred lines, dancers rewrote roles, and sacred figures stood tall without needing to explain themselves. Where being in between wasn't a mistake, it was sometimes the whole point, and maybe, just maybe, that world isn't as far away as we think. Let's ease into something even more surprising tonight. Something that tends to stop modern readers in their tracks and make them go, wait, what? We're talking about same-sex desire in ancient India. And yes, it absolutely existed. Not as a hidden, shameful subculture, not tucked away in footnotes, but brace yourself, sometimes right there in the open, acknowledged in literature, art and mythology. So if you've been told queer love is some modern invention, or worse, a Western import, ancient India is about to politely, poetically and sensually disagree. We'll start as always with the gods. Hindu mythology doesn't shy away from gender bending or love between men, or between women for that matter. One of the most well-known stories involves Krishna and Aravan, a lesser-known warrior from the Mahabharata. Aravan agrees to sacrifice himself in battle, but before dying, he wants to marry and experience love at least once. No one steps forward, because understandably, marrying a man who'll die the next day isn't the hottest prospect. But Krishna, in an act of divine empathy, transforms into his female form Mohini, marries Aravan, and spends the night with him. The next morning, Aravan dies, and Krishna mourns as his widow. It's one of the most powerful stories of divine gender transformation and same-sex love in Indian lore. Now here's the historical kicker. This story is still honoured today. In Tamil Nadu, during the annual Kuvagam festival, thousands of transgender and gender non-conforming people gather to reenact that very wedding. They dress as brides, marry Aravan in his temple, and the next morning they mourn his death, channeling both devotion and identity. It's spiritual, it's emotional, and it's unapologetically queer. This isn't an isolated story. Hindu, Jain, and even Buddhist texts contain references to men who loved men and women who desired other women. The Kama Sutra, that famous text we keep going back to, includes a full section on male-male love, specifically detailing the role of men who take pleasure in other men, especially those known as klebas or sanda. Vatsyayana doesn't shame them. He describes their behaviours with the same clinical, descriptive tone used for heterosexual couples. He even offers advice on how such lovers might engage intimately, and how courtesans might adapt their skills to meet the needs of male-male clients. And then there are the love poems. Ancient Sanskrit and Tamil literature includes verses that seem to speak to same-sex longing, sometimes subtly coded, sometimes not so much. In some poems, a woman dreams of another woman's touch. In others, two male warriors share a bond that clearly goes beyond battle strategy. These aren't modern reinterpretations. They're old, rooted in a culture that understood desire in more than two dimensions. Let's toss in a quirky fringe fact here. In certain regions of ancient India, same-sex unions, even if not legally formalised, were honoured with rituals resembling marriage. In some rural pockets of tradition, friendship marriages between women involved exchanging garlands and vows, living together, and even being buried side by side. Scholars debate whether these were purely platonic or romantic, but oral histories and local songs suggest that, for many, the bond was just as deep and sacred as any other. Now, was ancient India a queer utopia? Of course not. Context matters. There were still social roles, caste expectations, and plenty of room for gossip, rejection, or marginalisation. Some texts described same-sex desire as a natural variation, while others called it a karmic condition or past life effect. The tone varied, curious in some texts, neutral in others, and dismissive in a few. But here's the key. It existed. It was seen. It was named. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how normalised these behaviours were in daily life. Some say the openness in texts didn't reflect lived reality, that people still faced pushback or had to hide. Others argue that India's pre-colonial society had far more fluidity than we give it credit for, especially compared to the later Victorian lens that blanketed everything in imported shame. That lens would come much later, and it's responsible for a lot of the erasure we see today. Because here's the twist. A lot of the discomfort around queerness in modern South Asian cultures didn't originate in ancient India. It came from colonialism. British laws, like Section 377, criminalised unnatural acts and shoved centuries of tradition into a tightly sealed drawer labelled immoral. That law stayed in place until 2018, So for nearly 150 years, the official narrative was that same-sex desire was something deviant, when in reality, it had danced through India's stories, songs and shrines for millennia. Let's zoom in for a second. Imagine two young men in a village, training together with bows and spears, learning Sanskrit hymns by day, but slipping away at dusk to sit beneath the banyan tree. Maybe they don't have words for what they feel, no identity labels, no parades, but in the hush of evening they hold hands. One of them quotes a verse from a love poem and the other answers with a smile. There's no judgment here, just two souls meeting, like countless others have across the ages, outside the rules, beyond definition. And now, let's pan to two women, one braiding the other's hair by lamplight. They've been inseparable since girlhood, sharing secrets, saris, sleep. No one asks questions, women being close is normal, but inside their shared glance is something older than language, something soft and unshakable. And in this moment at least no one tells them it's wrong. So as your eyes grow heavy and the sounds of night wrap around you like a shawl, take comfort in this. The love that dares to speak its name has always been speaking. In temples, in poetry, in moonlit walks, in the stories that survived erasure because they were carved into the very bones of the land. Queer love isn't new. It's ancient. It's divine. And in many corners of old India, it was something far more precious than tolerated. It was quietly blessed. Alright, so we've danced through divine unions and even snuck peeks at gender-fluid love stories, but now we're pulling the brakes hard. Because tonight, we're stepping into the tension point where ancient India's open views on pleasure collided with something far more complex: celibacy. Yep, the sacred art of saying no thanks to sex, even when everything in your body is shouting yes please. And spoiler, this wasn't about shame. Not entirely anyway. In many traditions, celibacy was a power move, an intentional, disciplined choice that came with some serious spiritual cred. But, as always, things weren't quite so simple. So let's start with the big picture. In the Indian worldview, brahmacharya, the practice of celibacy, was one of the pillars of spiritual life, especially during the student phase. From the Vedas to later yogic and ascetic texts, celibacy wasn't seen as repressive, it was seen as redirection. You weren't shutting down your desire, you were rerouting it into mental clarity, spiritual growth, even superpowers. No, really, some yogis believed that preserving your sexual energy could lead to heightened perception, miraculous strength, and even levitation. Basically, keep it in your pants long enough and you just might float. But it wasn't just for monks in caves. Celibacy was also practiced, at least temporarily, by married folks, students, warriors, and even pregnant women. It could be seasonal, hello, monsoon fasting, situational, mourning periods, or a permanent vow taken during a spiritual awakening. And while we're here, let's be real, not everyone was good at it. That brings us to our historical snack. In many Jain and Buddhist sects, full renunciation included total celibacy, even in thought. And if you slipped up, even with a dream or spontaneous, let's call it unintentional discharge, you had to confess it publicly to your spiritual community. Imagine standing in front of your fellow monks and admitting that last night's dream about the mango seller got a little too vivid. It was brutal and weirdly common. Even the Buddha himself wasn't spared the temptations of the flesh, at least according to legend. One story tells of Mara, the god of illusion, sending his 3 beautiful daughters to seduce the meditating Buddha. He sat still, unmoved, like a stone in a storm. They danced, whispered, laughed. Nothing. Total monk mode. That scene wasn't just myth. It became the poster image of perfect restraint. But let's be honest, everyone was aware that temptation was a thing. The key was learning to notice desire without grabbing onto it. Fringe fact of the night. Some ascetics went so far in avoiding desire that they would pluck out all their body hair, including eyebrows, just in case the sensation became arousing. Others covered their eyes or refused to touch food prepared by women, thinking even a waft of feminine presence could undo years of self-control. That's commitment, or fear, or both. Now, here's where the drama thickens. Despite the high value placed on celibacy, ancient Indian stories are full of renunciants who break their vows, sometimes dramatically. Sage Vishwamitra, for instance, went full yogi mode until the Apsara Menaka was sent to seduce him, and it worked. He abandoned his meditation, fell in love, and had a daughter. Same thing happened with other sages too. Desire in these tales isn't a sin, it's a test. Sometimes you pass. Sometimes you tumble face first into passion and emerge wiser for it. Scholars continue to debate whether these tales are moral warnings, cautionary fables, or subtle acknowledgements that celibacy, while admirable, is deeply human and incredibly hard. Maybe the gods weren't judging, just pointing out that even the most spiritually devoted aren't immune to longing, that it's part of the path, not necessarily a detour. Now flip the coin. Not all celibacy was imposed. Some people chose it with pride. Certain schools of Tantra, for example, practiced a form of sexual sublimation, not rejection, but internalization. You'd feel the desire, honour it, and then use breathwork, chanting and meditation to transmute it into spiritual fuel. You weren't denying the fire, you were directing it up your spine instead of out into the world. And for some, celibacy was liberation from obligation. Women, in particular, sometimes turned to spiritual paths as a way to escape forced marriage or endless childbirth. Becoming a nun or an ascetic gave them autonomy. It was a quiet rebellion, a way of saying, I belong to no man, not even to my body's demands. That's not repression, that's resistance. But not everyone was thrilled about renunciation. There are ancient plays, poems, and folk tales where the celibate character is mocked, seduced, or tempted by clever lovers. In one popular story, a young woman disguises herself as a hermit to sneak into an ashram and flirt with a particularly stubborn monk. The punchline? He finally gives in, and they both laugh at the absurdity of pretending they were ever immune to each other. So what does this tell us? That ancient India held space for both paths, pleasure and discipline, union and solitude. You weren't expected to choose one forever, but to understand each deeply, to taste desire without drowning in it. To say no, not because you're afraid, but because you've learned how to pause, and that pause sometimes was as sacred as the act itself. As your eyelids grow heavy and your thoughts turn slow and syrupy, imagine a silent forest path, dotted with ash-covered monks and saffron-robed nuns, walking without speaking. Somewhere in that quiet a thought flares, a memory, a desire, and they let it pass like a breeze through trees, not because they don't feel it, but because they know how to watch it without reaching. And maybe that's a lesson worth carrying, that restraint isn't the absence of desire, it's the mastery of it. And in that mastery, there's a different kind of pleasure, one not of the body, but of the soul. So far we've walked through moonlit courtyards and monastic forests, peeking into the lives of farmers and philosophers, but tonight we're slipping through the carved doors of a royal palace, velvet drapes, sandalwood floors, the air thick with incense and intrigue. Because if sex was a sacred art in ancient India, then the royals were its most well-funded patrons. They didn't just read the Kama Sutra, they commissioned handwritten copies with gold leaf illustrations. They didn't just fantasize, they hired poets to compose love verses about last night's dreams. And if there was one class of people who knew how to turn sensuality into both pleasure and power, it was the kings, queens, and their chosen lovers. Now, to be clear, the royal bedroom was less about romance and more about strategy. Sexuality in the palace wasn't just personal, it was political. Marriage alliances were forged in bed. Heirs were born from well-timed rendezvous. Even pleasure itself was a form of status. To be seen as virile, skilled, or irresistibly desirable was to hold influence, not just over partners, but over ministers, generals, even rival kingdoms. If a king was rumoured to be weak in the bedroom, it wasn't just gossip, it was a comment on his entire rule. So who were these royal lovers? Well, you had queens, of course, but their roles were often wrapped in duty. Produce an heir, keep the court stable, represent virtue. But then you had the courtesans. These weren't random entertainers. They were highly educated, trained in music, poetry, etiquette, and the fine art of flirtation. The best of them could seduce without touching, outwit ministers in debate, and recite an entire raga while pouring wine. Courtesans were, in many cases, unofficial advisors. Lovers, yes, but also cultural tastemakers, even spies. They listened, watched, and, when needed, whispered just the right words into the right ears. Historical fact time. In cities like Ujjain and Varanasi, the courtesan houses weren't tucked away in back alleys. They stood near temples, often supported by royal patrons. Famous courtesans like Amrapali in the Buddhist texts were not only celebrated for their beauty but for their wisdom. She was courted by kings, respected by monks, and eventually became a nun. Imagine being so captivating that your face ends up painted on a temple wall and carved into a teaching scroll. Fringe fact of the night? Some kings, like those in the Gupta period, supposedly held competitions to determine who was the most skilled lover, not in secret but as public celebrations. There were even rumoured pleasure gardens stocked not with exotic birds but with sensuous art, scented ponds, and little pavilions designed for everything but bird watching. And what about queens? They weren't just passive observers. Some were known to keep their own lovers, discreetly or otherwise. In certain texts, a queen's sexuality was linked to the fertility of the land. If she was neglected, crops failed. If she was satisfied, the kingdom thrived. It sounds symbolic, but these myths were often taken seriously. Intimacy was seen as a microcosm of cosmic harmony. A queen's joy wasn't just personal, it was national. But this isn't a fairy tale. The royal world could be brutal. Women, especially those in harems, were often pawns in a much larger game. Their bodies, movements, and choices were controlled. Competition for favour could turn vicious. And while courtesans had influence, they also had no legal protections. One fall from grace, and they could lose everything. The palace gave generously, but it also took. And yet, within this glittering cage, there were moments of radical intimacy. Letters written in code, lovers meeting in moonlit balconies, silk-bound poetry exchanged like currency. One queen is said to have sent her husband a message by sending only a mango and a clove, symbols of passion and longing. He understood. They met that night. Scholars still debate how real these romantic flourishes were. Were they lived experiences or literary fantasy? Some argue the royal world was more transactional than tender. Others insist that behind the jewels and politics, genuine love did bloom. Maybe both are true. After all, even power-hungry kings fall hard sometimes. Even a courtesan can be undone by a poem. And here's another twist. Palace manuals on lovemaking weren't just about seduction. They included ethics. A ruler who ignored his partner's desires was seen as weak, not strong. Pleasure wasn't domination. It was skill, attentiveness, generosity. The ideal lover knew timing, rhythm, and emotional intelligence. Not exactly what most of us picture when we think ancient king, but hey, standards were high. Imagine it now. A massive marble room, perfumed with rose and jasmine. A soft breeze through an open jali window. Two people, not just royalty and consort, but human beings, sitting beside each other on a low bed. Maybe it starts with a poem, maybe with silence. Maybe they talk about politics first, or the rain, or the elephant who escaped the royal stable earlier that day. And then, slowly, like rain softening the earth, something unfolds. Not because they have to, but because, in that moment, even amid gold and duty, they want to. That's what makes royal sexuality in ancient India so fascinating. It wasn't separate from governance. It was governance. Intimacy as diplomacy. Pleasure as legacy. And yes, sometimes love is revolution. So tonight, as your breathing slows and your mind drifts through the corridors of memory and myth, picture this. A king, not in battle armour, but in silk. A queen, not in jewels, but in laughter. A courtesan, not just as ornament, but as oracle, and all of them in some secret chamber of the night trying to figure out the same thing we all do. How to connect, how to give, how to be seen. Tonight, we step away from royal chambers and sneak into something far more ancient and arguably more essential. Ayurveda, India's centuries-old system of medicine. And yes, you guessed it, even Ayurveda had a lot to say about sex. Not in a wear this crystal and chant softly kind of way, but in a grounded, practical and surprisingly scientific manner. Because in the Ayurvedic view, sex wasn't just recreation, it was rejuvenation. A tool for health, emotional balance and even longevity. That's right. Done right, sex could help you live longer. Done wrong, it could mess you up faster than a week of bad sleep and street food. So let's unpack that. According to Ayurvedic theory, your body is governed by three fundamental energies or doshas: Vata, air, Pitta, fire, and Kapha. earth, water. Every action you take, including sexual activity, either balances or disturbs these forces. Too much sex. You might deplete your ojas, the life essence that fuels vitality, immunity, and even spiritual glow. Too little? You risk a blocked energy, tension, anxiety. Like everything in Ayurveda, sex was about balance, not extremes. But this wasn't vague theory. Ancient Ayurvedic texts like the Karaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita went into excruciating detail about ideal timing, frequency, and even posture. For example, they advised that the best time for sex was during the night, ideally when both partners felt emotionally calm and physically rested. It wasn't a spontaneous quickie between goat herding shifts. It was a whole process, involving oils, diet, and intention. Historical fact of the night: the Charaka Samhita, one of the foundational texts of Ayurveda, includes an entire chapter called Vajkarana, which is basically the science of aphrodisiacs and virility. It gives recipes for herbal tonics made of things like clarified butter, honey, sesame, milk, and a touch of gold leaf, yes, actual gold. The goal wasn't just better performance, it was clarity of mind, healthy children, and emotional harmony. You weren't just satisfying your body, you were tuning your entire system. And then, there's the fringe fact that feels too poetic not to be true. Some Ayurvedic scholars believed that making love while facing the east could strengthen memory and intelligence. Face west? That might boost creativity. North? Spiritual growth? South? Don't do that one. That was considered bad for health. Imagine planning your bedroom layout based on chakra alignment and sunrise orientation. Call it cosmic feng shui. But Ayurveda didn't stop at tips and tonics. It also emphasized emotional compatibility. A healthy sex life, they believed, wasn't just about the act, it was about connection. They noted how resentment, anxiety, or power imbalance could disrupt not only the experience, but the health of the body itself. Emotional friction led to physical symptoms, digestive issues, skin problems, even chronic fatigue. That's right. Breakups could make you break out. Ancient Indian physicians knew it long before TikTok therapists did. Scholars still debate how widespread these teachings were. Some argue that Ayurveda was practiced mostly by trained physicians serving elites, with little impact on everyday people. Others believe that its principles, especially those around sexual wellness, filtered into the lives of common folks through folk medicine, midwives, temple healers, and oral tradition. After all, many of the aphrodisiacs recommended in classical texts like ashwagandha, shatavari, and honey were accessible, local, and easy to prepare. You didn't need a palace pantry to benefit. And yes, Ayurveda had its hang-ups too. It leaned heavily on the male perspective. Women's pleasure was acknowledged but often framed in terms of fertility and family harmony. There are sections describing the ideal temperament of a woman based on her dosha. And let's just say the kapha types didn't get the most flattering write-up. Still, even in this patriarchal lens, there was space to say, a woman deserves to be relaxed, nourished, and emotionally connected before sex, which, considering the time period, is honestly kind of revolutionary. Let's not forget the Ayurvedic warnings. Sex during indigestion, a terrible idea. Sex after heavy exercise, also bad. Sex when drunk, angry, or sad. Don't even think about it. In other words, Ayurveda was not vibing with reckless hookups. It treated intimacy with the same precision as surgery. Preparation mattered. So did mental state. And if you ignored the rules, well, good luck explaining your random rash or sudden insomnia to your neighbourhood Vaidya. Imagine a couple in a small village, lying under a neem tree, sipping warm milk with saffron before heading to bed. The man's just completed his evening oil massage. The woman's braided her hair and burned a little resin to clear the air. Their meal was light, their laughter easy. They take time, they breathe, and yes, they face east. The act itself is quiet, unhurried, almost meditative. In that moment, sex isn't just physical, it's medicine. And isn't that kind of beautiful? That pleasure could be healing, not just distracting. That two people could come together not just to chase a high, but to share strength, balance, prana. Modern wellness influencers are still trying to sell us versions of this. Ayurveda already had it figured out. So as you lie there tonight, cozy in your own perfectly imperfect body, let this truth sink in. Sex isn't just a spark. It can be a balm. It can be nourishment. It can be a quiet reminder that you're still alive, still connected, still capable of giving and receiving something real. Not always, not every time, but when it's right, when it's slow, when it's balanced. Maybe it's the best medicine there is. Tonight we step into the monsoon. Not just a season, but a mood, a shift in the air, the rhythm of the land, and, believe it or not, the libido. Because in ancient India, sex wasn't just a private moment. It was part of a larger cosmic rhythm. And when the skies cracked open, the earth softened, and the scent of wet soil filled the air, that rhythm pulsed louder. In poetry, in ritual, in literal household planning, monsoon meant one thing, fertility, which often translated to one very seasonal activity, making love. Let's set the scene. It's late June. The dry, exhausting heat of summer has broken. Thunder rolls in the distance, peacocks are screaming their weirdly seductive cries. Somewhere in the distance, a bamboo flute plays softly. The air smells like soaked earth and fresh jasmine. And in every love poem, every sculpture, every whispered folktale passed down through grandmothers, this moment, this storm, is when passion blooms. Monsoon wasn't just weather, it was a sensual awakening. This wasn't a coincidence. The monsoon was life-giving, literally. Crops could finally grow, rivers swelled, trees turned green again, and with all this lush rebirth, people began to mirror nature. Fertility rites were held in both public and private spaces. Couples were encouraged to come together, to conceive during this sacred, overflowing season. Some traditions believed children born from monsoon unions would be healthier, wiser, or spiritually gifted. The gods, after all, were closer during the rains. One of the most vivid examples of this sensual season is found in classical Sanskrit poetry, especially in the works of Kalidasa. In Meghaduta, or the Cloud Messenger, a lovelorn yaksha, nature spirit, sends a message to his wife via a passing monsoon cloud. He describes the thunder, the rivers, the lush forests, and the agony of being apart during such a sensual, storm-filled time. Because the worst fate, being separated from your lover when the world itself is brimming with touch, scent, and sound. Historical fact for the night. In some rural villages, monsoon festivals were tied directly to fertility rituals. Offerings were made to deities like Indra, god of rain, and Kamadeva, god of love, in the same breath. Women danced barefoot in wet courtyards. Men played drums. In certain regions, the married women would fast, pray, and swing on mango trees. Yes, literal swings, singing love songs to encourage the arrival of both rain and a future husband. The erotic was wrapped in the seasonal, and no one saw it as strange. And now for your fringe fact. Ancient Ayurvedic texts warned against having sex during intense summer heat, claiming it weakened the body. But once the rains arrived, the green light was back on. In fact, sex during the monsoon was thought to balance the doshas, replenish ojas, and strengthen emotional bonds. The body, like the land, needed water before it could be fruitful. Of course, not everyone agrees on how widespread these rituals were. Some scholars argue that monsoon-based eroticism is mostly a poetic device, great for literature, but not necessarily a reflection of daily practice. Others insist that the sensuality of the rainy season was baked into cultural life across all classes, especially in agricultural communities where seasonal cycles literally governed everything. The truth probably lives in both places. Part art, part real life, always tangled. And remember, this wasn't just about sex. It was about a deep reconnection with nature, with others, with the self. The rains symbolized release, a kind of softening, emotional openness. The hard, dusty stoicism of summer gave way to something more vulnerable. You could cry during the monsoon. You could write love letters. You could reach for someone in the dark and not have to explain why. It was allowed. Imagine a couple sitting near a window watching the rain pour down. They're quiet. Maybe they haven't touched in weeks. Life's been busy, dry, demanding. But now the air is different. There's a breeze. The clothes cling just a little more. The tea tastes sweeter. Their hands find each other again, not urgently, but slowly, like rain soaking into cracked earth. And there, without ceremony, desire returns. Not because it was summoned, but because the season carried it in. There's a soft magic to seasonal sex, a feeling that your body is participating in something larger, something as old as the clouds themselves. You're not just giving in to desire, you're honouring the rhythm of the land, the heartbeat of the sky. In a culture that saw the universe as one great web of interconnected energies, this kind of attunement wasn't optional. It was vital, and the monsoon didn't just inspire private moments. It shaped entire art forms. Temple dancers performed Varsharaga, melodies inspired by rain. Painters depicted Radha and Krishna beneath stormy skies, their limbs entwined beneath a single yellow scarf. Erotic scenes were painted with clouds in the background, a signal that this wasn't just passion, it was cosmic renewal. So tonight, close your eyes and picture the monsoon, not as a storm, but as a soft permission to feel, to touch, to reconnect. Let your breath slow with the rhythm of distant thunder. Let the scent of wet earth fill your chest. And imagine that even now, centuries later, some part of you still responds to the rain like your ancestors did. Not with umbrellas, but with open arms. Because sometimes the best time for love isn't when everything's perfect. It's when everything is soaked, messy, unplanned, just like life, just like us. Let's get into the visual language of seduction tonight. Because while ancient texts could wax poetic about longing and technique, a whole other conversation was happening through clothing, or rather, the strategic removal of it. In ancient India, dress wasn't just about modesty or utility. It was a language of flirtation, a slow dance of fabric and skin, gesture and glance. What you wore, how you wore it, and even what you didn't wear could speak volumes. This wasn't just fashion, it was foreplay. Start with the basics. Most people wore unstitched garments. Saris, dhotis, angavastrams, turbans, everything was draped, tied or wrapped. That meant it could also be unwrapped with a certain flair. A slipping palu, the end of a sari, a loosely tied waistband, a shoulder bare, by accident. These were all subtle cues, as intimate as a whispered line of poetry. No zippers, no buttons, just knots, folds, and the occasional glimmer of skin. Like an unspoken promise. Sculptures from ancient temples often show women in sheer, clinging garments, tied low on the hips, leaving the midriff exposed. The look wasn't scandalous. It was considered elegant. In fact, the belly was seen as especially erotic, associated with fertility and sensuality. The body wasn't hidden. It was framed, celebrated, stylized. The idea was not to conceal but to highlight, to draw the eye to curves, movement and softness, especially during dance or ritual. Historical fact to tuck into your silk pillow tonight. In early Indian fashion, transparency wasn't taboo. Many textiles were woven so finely, like muslin or chiffon-like silks from Bengal, that they earned names like woven air or morning mist. The most prized fabrics could pass through a ring, or lie across a mirror without blurring the reflection. Wearing one of these wasn't about staying warm, it was about creating allure through suggestion. And then there's the hair, long, oiled, and often left loose during festivals or romantic evenings. In public, a woman's hair was usually tied up, practical, orderly, proper. But in private, letting it fall was a classic symbol of readiness. Add a few jasmine flowers, maybe a dab of sandalwood paste behind the ear, and boom, you've entered the chat. Men weren't left out of the seduction game either. Warriors and nobles would oil their chests, line their eyes with kohl, wear jewels on their arms and around their necks. Scent mattered. So did posture. The Kama Sutra even suggests that a man should walk with a certain grace, not too stiff, not too loose, just enough to show confidence without arrogance. Because yes, even back then, people were judging your vibe before you said a word. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In some ancient Indian love rituals, couples would exchange garments after sex, literally swapping clothes as a gesture of intimacy and trust. Think of it as the original oversized hoodie moment, but with silks. And a lot more sandalwood. Of course, there's debate among scholars about how naked ancient India really was. Some argue that temple carvings and poetic verses represent a kind of idealized aesthetic, not everyday attire. Others suggest that regional climates, professions and caste roles dictated what people wore and how much they showed. A labourer in southern India might have worn less than a Brahmin priest up north, but that didn't mean one was more or less modest. It was context. And context, as always, shaped everything. What's less debatable is that nudity itself wasn't automatically sexual or shameful. In many yogic and ascetic traditions, nudity was about transcendence. Jain monks often renounced clothing entirely as a symbol of detachment. Their nudity wasn't erotic, it was spiritual. But here's the twist. Even that could be visually striking, and depending on who was watching, possibly complicated. Because the body, no matter how holy, still has power. Seduction in ancient India was rarely direct. It was all in the build-up. A glance across a festival crowd, a flick of the wrist while serving mangoes, a foot peeking from beneath the folds of a sari. The slowness of unwrapping something was part of the pleasure. Even the act of undressing was ritualized, done in a certain order, with scented oils, maybe a line of poetry murmured between layers. You weren't just removing clothing, you were removing barriers. Imagine a woman preparing for a lover. She oils her hair, lets it fall over one shoulder. She chooses a soft, translucent sari, red or golden maybe, and ties it lower than usual. Her ankles are adorned with tiny silver bells. She adds a line of kohl to her eyes, enough to deepen the gaze. Not too much perfume, just a hint of rose water, dabbed behind the knees. She walks slowly. The sway of her hips says what her words never will. Now imagine him waiting. He's bathed, scented with vetiver, chest bare but draped in a fine dhoti. A gold chain rests against his collarbone. He's nervous, just enough. Not because he's unsure of the act, but because this night means something. Their clothes speak for them before they do. This wasn't cosplay. This was intimacy wrapped in fabric. Sensuality expressed in folds, creases, silks, and slips. Ancient India knew that suggestion could be stronger than display, that the imagination, properly tempted, was more powerful than any garment dropped to the floor. So as you drift off tonight, think not of clothes as barriers, but as invitations. Think of the ways we still use them to express desire, vulnerability, confidence. Think of the ancient weavers spinning translucent muslin, knowing exactly what kind of message their cloth would send. Think of how you dress when you want to be seen, and how the people you love look at you when the seeing begins, because seduction doesn't start with a touch. It starts with a glance, a fold, a knot. And sometimes, the most intimate thing of all, is the way something almost slips off. Tonight, we fold ourselves into the fabric of something less glamorous, but deeply woven into the structure of ancient Indian life, marriage. Not the Disney kind, not the rom-com variety either. We're talking about arranged marriages, dynastic obligations, astrological matchups, and, yes, what was expected to happen once the garlands were exchanged and the guests finally left. Because if sex was sacred and marriage was sacred, you'd think the combination would be bliss, right? Not always. Let's start with the obvious. Marriages in ancient India weren't usually about love. They were about duty, a way to cement alliances, preserve caste lines, ensure clean karma for the next generation, and, above all, keep the social order as tidy as a freshly swept courtyard. Love, if it came at all, usually came after marriage, if it came. And yet, despite this somewhat utilitarian setup, sex within marriage wasn't just tolerated, it was expected, even required. Texts like the Dharma Shastra and Griha Sutras spelled it out clearly. Husbands had sexual obligations. Wives did too. If a husband ignored his wife's needs, especially if it led her to feel neglected or seek affection elsewhere, he was the one considered out of alignment with Dharma. Likewise, if a wife was expected to be available at appropriate times, remember all those moon phase rules, but she also had a right to satisfaction, not just duty. Let's add a historical nugget here. In the Arthashastra, that hardcore political manual attributed to Chanakya, there's an entire section on royal marriage dynamics, including clauses about conjugal rights. It acknowledges that kings, despite their busy schedule of conquest and intrigue, should not ignore their queens in the bedroom. Failure to do so, potential unrest in the palace, emotionally and politically. Now, were these rights evenly enforced? Of course not. Patriarchy was still the reigning deity in most households, but the fact that emotional and sexual reciprocity was even discussed is worth noting. Marriage wasn't supposed to be a prison. Ideally, it was a mutual partnership complete with late-night pillow talk, well-timed caresses, and the occasional mango-sharing moment. But what about those first nights? The infamous wedding night. You've probably heard a lot of dramatic portrayals, especially in pop culture. But in ancient India, the wedding night, or Ratri Bhoj, literally night meal, wasn't always the big event it's made out to be. Sometimes consummation was delayed for days, even weeks, especially if the bride was young or nervous. There were rituals to ease into it. Shared meals, playful games, slow introductions to touch and scent. The couple was supposed to feel a bit like strangers gently finding their way. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In some regions, an older female relative, often a widowed aunt, might coach the new bride ahead of time, teaching her not just what to expect physically, but how to initiate pleasure, how to breathe, how to relax. It wasn't framed as scandalous, it was wisdom, passed down like a family recipe, but for connection. Of course, not all marriages were gentle or consensual. Some were hurried, some were strategic, some were unwanted, and some were, let's be honest, outright oppressive. But again, we're dealing with a spectrum. While the structure could be restrictive, the personal dynamics within a marriage varied wildly. Some couples were close, affectionate, even passionate. Others were distant, formal, or silently resentful. But even in more emotionally barren pairings, sex was often viewed as a bridge, a way to maintain harmony and dharma, even if love wasn't bubbling over. And scholars still wrestle with a key question. How much freedom did women have to express desire inside marriage? Ancient texts like the Kama Sutra actually advise husbands to be attentive to their wives' moods, to learn their rhythms, to listen. There are instructions on how to rekindle a wife's interest, how to apologize after a fight, how to build anticipation. These aren't just about sex, they're about emotional intelligence. Yet in reality, a lot depended on caste, class, and location. A royal wife in Ujjain had more leeway than a farmer's wife in a remote village. There's also the matter of polyandry. Yes, it existed. In certain Himalayan regions, particularly among the Pandavas of Mahabharata fame, a woman might have multiple husbands, usually brothers. It wasn't about wild orgies, it was about preserving land and property in challenging terrains. But still, the dynamics of these marriages were sexual and emotional, and everyone knew it. It wasn't taboo, it was logistical. On the flip side, polygamy among men, especially wealthy or royal men, was common. Kings had multiple wives and concubines, often for political or dynastic reasons. But again, this wasn't just about quantity. Each relationship had its own energy, rituals, expectations. Sex wasn't always part of every marriage, but when it was, it carried spiritual, social, and karmic weight. Imagine a married couple in a small town. It's late at night, and they've just finished prayers. The lamps are low and the kids are asleep. They sit on opposite sides of the bed, not speaking. Then one of them reaches out, just a hand on a shoulder, nothing rushed. Maybe they talk for a bit, maybe they don't. But slowly, quietly, they find their way toward each other. Not out of duty, not out of timing, but because there's comfort there. Familiarity, a rhythm, even if imperfect. That too, in its own way, is sacred. Marriage in ancient India wasn't about perfection, it was about balance. Sex wasn't about fireworks, it was about connection, healing, continuity. It could be romantic, it could be transactional, it could even be revolutionary, especially when couples defied caste norms or allowed love to guide them. But at its core, sex in marriage was viewed as stabilizing, a way to keep the house warm, the soul anchored. So tonight, as you lie back and let the past wash over you like incense smoke, consider this. Marriage wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a long, winding conversation, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, between two people learning how to touch, not just with their hands, but with their time, their words, their breath. And maybe, in that slow unfolding, love had a chance to bloom, not in the spark, but in the warmth that followed. Tonight, let's slide out of duty-bound beds and tiptoe into the shadows, into the space where desire didn't always follow the rules. Because for every sanctioned, star-aligned marriage, there were stories, so many stories, of stolen glances, moonlit rendezvous, forbidden kisses, and lovers who crossed every social line to get to each other. Ancient India, for all its rituals and rules, was never immune to the thrill of the illicit. In fact, some of its most passionate, poetic, and scandalous tales happen outside the marital bed. You see, while marriage was revered, love, true, messy, unpredictable, rule-breaking love had a charm that no dharmic checklist could contain. Forbidden relationships were everywhere in ancient Indian literature. A sage falling for a celestial nymph, a courtesan in love with a merchant's wife, a village girl climbing a wall to meet the prince who shouldn't even know her name. And somehow, even when these stories ended badly, and they often did, they were told and retold with a kind of reverent awe. Like desire, even when reckless, was still somehow divine. Let's start with the Kathasaritsagara, or Ocean of the Streams of Stories, an epic 11th century collection of tales, where lovers defy caste, class, and common sense on nearly every page. In one story, a Brahmin's wife falls in love with a travelling dancer and begins sneaking out at night using a rope made of her own hair. When she's finally caught, the punishment is swift, but the tale doesn't judge her. It ends with a narrator musing on how powerful love can be, how it burns reason like dry grass. Not exactly a PSA for chastity. Now for a solid historical fact, ancient Indian law codes did have rules against adultery, especially for women. A man caught with another man's wife could face steep fines or worse, especially if the husband was of a higher caste. But interestingly, many texts treat female desire with unexpected empathy. A woman neglected by her husband for long periods, not entirely her fault if she wandered. In some versions of the Manusmriti, if a man didn't fulfill his wife's needs, she had spiritual grounds for leaving him. Not exactly a green light for affairs, but certainly more nuanced than a simple sin label. Fringe fact of the night. There's a 9th century Sanskrit love manual that warns lovers engaged in secret affairs to never leave behind jewellery, hairpins or fragrance, because those were the easiest ways to get caught. And yes, it includes a section on how to scale walls quietly. The ancient equivalent of delete your texts and use the side gate. But perhaps the most iconic tale of forbidden love in Indian law is that of Radha and Krishna. Unlike Shiva and Parvati, who are married and spiritually merged, Radha and Krishna's relationship exists outside of social norms. Radha is married to another man. Krishna is a divine playboy, simultaneously godly and emotionally elusive, and yet their love, intense, aching, and technically adulterous, is held up as the highest metaphor for spiritual longing. The gopis leave their homes, their families, even their reputations behind to dance with Krishna in the moonlight. It's not duty that pulls them, it's bhakti, or a love that consumes. The fact that it's forbidden makes it even more potent. Scholars continue to debate whether these stories reflect actual social leniency or are simply literary fantasies. Some argue that common folk had far less freedom, and that affairs, when discovered, could ruin reputations or worse. Others believe that extramarital love, while risky, was quietly tolerated, especially in urban centres where anonymity and shared complicity made things easier to hide. In either case, one thing's clear. The idea of forbidden love fascinated people, no matter their station. And let's not pretend men had all the fun. Women too initiated secret romances. Some did so out of loneliness, some out of rebellion, and some out of sheer curiosity. The Kama Sutra acknowledges this, listing clever tricks women use to slip past guards, time their rendezvous during festivals, or communicate through coded songs. In one example, a woman sends her lover a banana leaf marked with red dye, an ancient emoji for meet me tonight. Direct, effective, biodegradable. Of course, not all affairs were romantic. Some were coercive. Some involved manipulation, power imbalance, or survival. Just as in modern times, the line between seduction and exploitation could blur, especially in cases involving royalty or spiritual authority. But even then, many stories give space to the desire itself, acknowledging that longing doesn't always follow the rules of righteousness, that love, or at least lust, isn't neatly sorted into moral and immoral. Imagine now a small village in the dry heartland. A woman draws water from a well, glancing up to see a travelling bard passing through. Their eyes lock. He sings something teasing, she laughs without meaning to. That night, she waits by her courtyard wall, unsure if he'll come back. He does, just for an hour. The air smells like rain. They speak little, and by morning he's gone. No promise, no plan, just the memory of one night that cracked her routine open like a ripe fig. Ancient India wasn't naive about the consequences. Illicit love had a cost. Social, spiritual, sometimes physical. but it also had a certain spark that even the most conservative stories couldn't quite extinguish. It reminded people that underneath the saris and turbans and holy texts, there were beating hearts, unpredictable, messy, gloriously alive hearts. So as you curl deeper into your blanket and let your thoughts wander where they will, remember this. Not all love stories follow the script. Some leap fences, some hide in shadows, some live only in memory, stolen and soft. But all of them, every one, whispers something ancient. Desire doesn't care about permission, it just knocks. Tonight we shift from secret affairs and poetic longing to something much more practical, and yet still deeply intimate: pregnancy. Or more specifically, pregnancy, contraception, and the delicate dance between fertility and family planning in ancient India. Because while sex was revered and children were a blessing, not every moment of intimacy was aimed at procreation. Even thousands of years ago, people were trying to figure out how to control when, how often, and if a child would come along. And believe it or not, they had their own answers, some clever, some bizarre, some surprisingly ahead of their time. Let's start with the basics. Having children was in many ways a sacred duty. Sons were especially prized, as they carried the family name, performed funeral rites, and inherited property. Daughters? Loved, yes, but often seen as temporary guests in the household, destined to marry and leave. So getting pregnant was a big deal, and fertility was wrapped in ritual, astrology, Ayurveda, and a healthy dose of hope. But despite this high cultural value on reproduction, ancient Indians weren't baby-making machines. They had methods, some spiritual, some scientific, for spacing births and, when desired, preventing them altogether. According to Ayurveda, timing was everything. The right time of month, the right planetary alignment, even the right direction during intercourse could influence not only whether a child would be conceived, but what kind of child. Want a brave son? Try on a Tuesday. Hoping for a wise daughter? Avoid Wednesdays and aim for a full moon. These were less mystic nonsense and more a system of logic deeply tied to cosmic belief. The body was a universe, and conception was a moment of alignment between the microcosm and the macrocosm. Historical fact for the night. The Charaka Samhita, that classic medical text we've visited before, contains chapters dedicated to fertility, miscarriage, and methods for delaying conception. It outlines dietary regimens, herbal preparations, and even behavioural guidelines for those trying to avoid pregnancy, proof that this wasn't a topic swept under the rug. People talked about it, they studied it, and yes, ancient Indian texts describe contraceptive techniques, mostly plant-based. Think herbal pessaries, little plugs or pastes made of neem, honey, rock salt, or even ghee mixed with powdered herbs. Some were inserted vaginally to create a barrier, while others aimed to alter the body's internal balance to prevent conception. There are references to cotton soaked in specific decoctions, and oral tonics thought to cool the womb or temporarily reduce fertility. Effectiveness? Mixed, obviously. But the effort was there, and the knowledge passed down through midwives, healers, and older women in the community, keepers of generational wisdom. Here's your fringe fact. Neem oil, still used in parts of India today, was believed to have spermicidal properties. Modern research has actually confirmed that neem may have contraceptive effects, though it's far from foolproof. Still, it's wild to think that someone in a clay hut 2,000 years ago might have discovered this just by watching goats chew leaves and fail to reproduce. Now, when pregnancy did happen, it was surrounded by layers of care. Rituals for healthy development included chants, music, and specific foods. The woman's moods were considered incredibly important, not just for her well-being, but for shaping the soul of the child within. Stories were read aloud, aromatics were used, massages given. In many traditions, it was believed that the soul of the child entered the womb during a precise moment, typically around the 3rd month, and from that point on, everything the mother experienced would shape that being. But not every pregnancy was welcomed, and here's where the conversation darkens. Ancient texts do include references, albeit sparse and coded, to abortion. Called Garbha Paterna, it was typically discouraged and framed as a moral and karmic issue. However, exceptions appear in medical texts where a pregnancy threatens the life of the mother. Some scholars argue this shows a recognition of reproductive complexity. Others see it as a loophole for more common but unspoken practices. Debates still rage among historians. How common was birth control really? Were these methods only used by courtesans and temple dancers who had more autonomy over their bodies? Or were they passed quietly through generations of wives who simply didn't want 10 children in a row? Hard to say. What we do know is that knowledge existed. Women weren't just passive vessels, they made choices, whispered secrets, ground herbs in the kitchen late at night. And men? They had their own roles. Some Ayurvedic texts advise men to avoid sex when angry, intoxicated, or physically depleted, not just because it would lead to poor health, but because it could result in weak offspring, whatever that meant. Timing and intention were everything. A child born of chaotic union was thought to inherit that instability. So even in procreation, mindfulness mattered. Now imagine a young woman in a village, newly married, uncertain. Her mother-in-law gives her a paste made of crushed seeds and neem oil. No words are exchanged, just the knowledge passed silently. Or a courtesan in a city, mixing a sweet tonic after entertaining a client, her routine as precise as any priest's prayer. These moments weren't part of the epic poems, but they were part of real life. And for the women who did want children, rituals like Pumsavana, performed in the 3rd month of pregnancy, were designed to ensure the birth of a male child. Some involved specific chants, others involved herbal applications or dietary changes. You might roll your eyes now, but for families desperate for an heir, these rituals were acts of hope, steeped in anxiety and love. Sex, in this framework, wasn't just physical. It was generative. It had consequences. It could bring joy, life, stress, transformation. It had to be managed, respected, sometimes manipulated. And through all of this, women were rarely given the loudest voice in the texts, but their actions, passed through back rooms and hushed rituals, spoke volumes. So as you rest tonight, consider this quiet power, the ability to bring forth life, to shape the future, or to pause it, to choose, even in whispers, to reach for herbs and timing and silence, to know, even when no one wrote it down, how to guide the body's rhythm. Because long before birth control had branding or a pill bottle, it had roots, leaves, fire, moonlight, and women who knew how to wait. Tonight, we slip down a different path, one that winds through incense-thick corridors and perfumed courtyards, where ankle bells tinkle like wind chimes and laughter carries late into the evening. We're entering the world of sex work in ancient India, a world more nuanced than the word prostitute could ever contain. Because here, sexuality wasn't just a commodity. In many cases, it was a skill, a discipline, even a sacred art. And the women, sometimes men, who practiced it weren't always outcasts. Sometimes they were cultural icons. Other times they were temple servants. Occasionally, they were queens in everything but name. Let's start by dismantling the modern assumption that sex work in the past was purely exploitative, grimy, or tragic. While, yes, exploitation existed, how could it not? Ancient Indian societies carved out specific social roles for erotic professionals. The word you're looking for here is Ganika. A Ganika wasn't just someone who sold sex. She was a trained courtesan, fluent in poetry, music, politics, conversation, and seduction. Think less mistress for hire, more emotional consultant with a dance repertoire and a closet full of silk. Historical fact for the night. Kautilya's Arthashastra, the political manual we've referenced before, contains an entire section detailing the regulation of Ganikas, their training, rights, income, and even state support. That's right. In some places, the state paid for their training in the 64 arts of love, Chatushashti Kalas, which included singing, perfumery, storytelling, and even chess. They were considered public figures, entertainers, intellectuals, seducers, and sometimes spies. Their craft was institutionalized, regulated, and, strangely enough, respected. The most famous courtesans weren't hidden away in shame. They were named. They hosted salons. Their wit was legendary. Amrapali, for example, was the state courtesan of Vaishali, a kind of officially recognized muse. Kings begged to be in her presence. Poets wrote about her grace. Eventually, she left everything to become a disciple of the Buddha. Her story was recorded not just as scandal, but as transformation. But there were also devadeses, young women dedicated to temples, especially in southern India. The word literally means servant of God. These women were trained in classical music and dance from a young age, performing rituals and sacred dances for the deity. Over time, some also became sexual companions to temple patrons, kings, or priests. And here's the complicated bit. While their roles were once spiritual, political, and even honoured, the lines between religious devotion and transactional sex blurred. Over centuries, the system became vulnerable to abuse. But in its earliest form, being a diva daisy meant prestige, training, and a powerful role in temple culture. Now for a delightfully strange fringe fact. Some texts claimed that a courtesan could revive a man whose virility had been diminished by heartbreak or illness. They weren't just for pleasure, they were healers. Using conversation, touch, and performance, they were thought to restore balance to the body and mind. Essentially, high-class therapists with much better outfits. Of course, not every sex worker was trained, empowered, or respected. As with any society, there were layers. Street-based sex work existed too, among the marginalised, the outcast, the desperate, and even the Ganakas and Devadasis, for all their status, lived in a precarious space. Their power depended on beauty, youth, talent, and patronage. Fall out of favour, and the very society that once praised them could shut its doors. This creates an interesting debate among scholars. Some argue that courtesans had more sexual autonomy than most married women. They chose their patrons, they controlled their finances, they even at times educated royal sons in the arts of love. Others caution against romanticising their lives. Training could be coercive. Daughters born into courtesan families were often expected to follow suit, and once a courtesan aged or lost favour, there were few protections in place. And let's not ignore the morality tug-of-war. Religious texts had very mixed feelings. Some celebrated these women as avatars of Shakti, the divine feminine power. Others labelled them as karmic distractions, obstacles on the path to enlightenment. Yet even the most prudish sources couldn't fully write them off. They kept showing up in stories, always complex, always captivating. Because in a society that worshipped love, music, poetry, and divine beauty, how could you erase the women who embodied all four? Picture this: a dusky evening in the city of Ujjain. Oil lamps flicker on the balconies of a Ganika's residence. The scent of jasmine trails from her wrists. A wealthy merchant sits nervously on silk cushions, listening to her sing a poem from Kalidasa, one he hasn't heard since his youth. She pours wine. They don't speak of coin, not yet. Tonight it's about remembering, about music, about being seen. Now shift to a temple town in Tamil Nadu. A Devadasi steps into the inner sanctum barefoot, her anklets chiming in rhythm. She dances not for kings, but for the god whose idol stands veiled in flowers. Her movements are slow, hypnotic. Her body, a living offering. The priests chant. The crowd watches in awe. She's both vessel and voice, sacred and sensual all at once. So as you drift into sleep tonight, let go of the stereotypes. Let go of shame. Let go of the modern instinct to flatten history into black and white. In ancient India, sex work existed in the grey. It was holy and worldly, celebrated and silenced. It raised temples. It toppled reputations. It taught pleasure and poetry. And in the soft, candlelit rooms of memory, the courtesans still linger, half in shadow, half in moonlight, reminding us that sexuality has never been simple. It has been art. It has been survival. It has been power. And above all, it has been human. Tonight we walk not into a palace or a temple or even a home, but into the library of the imagination, onto the worn scrolls, between the lines of verse, through the soft, frayed edges of ink and memory. Because while most people think Kama Sutra and stop there, ancient India had an entire bookshelf of erotic literature. Think of it like a centuries-old genre section labelled Romance and Sensuality, written by scholars, poets, physicians and dreamers who knew that love and desire weren't footnotes to life. They were the story itself. Let's get this out of the way. Yes, the Kama Sutra was famous, but it was never meant to be the one and only guide. It was part of a whole branch of literature called the Kama Sutra, or Science of Desire. These weren't just sex manuals, they were studies of attraction, behaviour, mood, and aesthetics. From how to arrange your bedsheets to what flowers to wear in your hair during different seasons, It wasn't just how to do it, it was how to feel it, how to invite it, how to write poems about it afterward. Take the Ratirahasya, Secrets of Love, written by Kokoka in the 11th century. This text reads like a pocket guide for the romantic soul. It categorizes women into types, not exactly progressive by modern standards, but hey, it tried to understand personality and sensual preference. It also describes the best times of day for intimacy, ideal settings, hint, flowers and moonlight are involved, and how to read subtle cues like body language, breath and eye movement. It's less Kama Sutra gym class, more emotional intelligence 101. Then there's the Anangaranga, which translates to the stage of the bodiless one, a poetic way of saying the playground of love. Written around the 15th century, this book took a more devotional approach. It wasn't just about physical pleasure, it treated sex as a divine act, capable of elevating both participants. It described foreplay in loving detail, emphasized mutual satisfaction, and encouraged experimenting with positions not just for novelty, but for compatibility. It also believed that a woman's pleasure was crucial, which, in a time when many cultures were still pretending women didn't even have sex drives, feels refreshingly human. Historical fact for your pillow tonight. Many of these texts were written in a style that mixed technical instruction with lyricism. They weren't dry medical guides, they were art. Think of verses that describe arousal with metaphors like the lotus trembling before the rising sun, or climaxes as the peacock's final cry before rain. The goal wasn't just information, it was immersion. You didn't read these books, you felt them. Fringe fact. There was even a genre of erotic riddles, yes, riddles. Short, clever poems with double meanings that usually ended with a sly punchline about anatomy, anticipation, or emotional mischief. These weren't just for fun, they were often recited during courtship or at royal gatherings as a way to signal interest without being overt. Imagine flirting with someone through cleverly veiled erotic poetry, all while sipping rosewater and pretending you're just enjoying the evening breeze. And then there's Sanskrit drama, which often included romantic subplots loaded with sexual tension. Kalidasa's Abhijanana Shakuntalam, the recognition of Shakuntala, is filled with longing looks, missed moments, and finally a passionate reunion. The sensuality is subdued but ever present, felt in the way a garment slips, a sigh lingers, or a lover hesitates at a doorway. These were emotional slow burns, centuries before streaming services figured out the formula. Scholars love to argue about how these texts were actually used. Were they luxury items, read only by the elite? Did they trickle down through oral storytelling, temple performance, and folk theatre? Or were they more like ancient self-help books, copied by scribes, shared among educated households, consulted in the flicker of an oil lamp when a marriage began to feel routine? Probably all of the above. And while we often imagine these texts as heteronormative, some included references to same-sex relationships, transgender identities, and fluid roles in pleasure. Not always openly, but enough to suggest that the human imagination, even in its most structured forms, rarely stays in its lane. Now picture this, a scholar in a dusty stone chamber, writing by lamplight. He dips his reed into ink, carefully brushing Sanskrit characters onto palm leaves. His face is calm, but his mind is buzzing. He's not writing for kings, he's writing for lovers, for the ones who whisper, who wait, who ache. For the girl who blushes when she receives a poem. For the boy who doesn't know how to say what he feels, so he memorizes a verse instead. Or maybe picture a young bride, uncertain on her wedding night. Her friend slips her a scroll wrapped in silk and says, "Read this when you're alone." Later, by the faint glow of a clay lamp, she opens it and finds not fear, but comfort. Words that name the thing she feels, that tell her she's not strange or wrong, just human, just alive. Erotic literature in ancient India wasn't just about sex, it was about presence, about attention, about using language to soften the space between two people. These texts weren't shameful, they were treasured, read aloud, memorized, annotated in the margins with tiny notes like, "Try this with honey," or "Face north for this one." So as you settle into sleep tonight, remember that not all seduction starts with a kiss. Sometimes it starts with a sentence, with ink on palm leaf, with a line of poetry whispered across centuries, still warm, still alive, still waiting to be read. by someone who dares to feel deeply. Because in the end, the most erotic thing might not be the body itself, but the words we find to describe it. Tonight, let's take a walk through the menagerie of ancient Indian symbolism, where animals weren't just creatures, they were metaphors, metaphysics, and sometimes, frankly, libido in disguise. In sacred art, poetry, temple carvings, and even bedroom manuals, animals weren't there for background scenery. They were central characters in the theatre of desire. Peacocks, snakes, elephants, monkeys, all cast into roles that, depending on the context, could represent beauty, longing, masculinity, femininity, or that awkward moment when the metaphor gets a little too real. Start with the peacock, the ultimate flirt. With its shimmering feathers, strut-like-you-mean-it attitude, and long associations with love and rain, it became a symbol of seductive charm. In many Sanskrit poems, a woman's voice is described as sweet as a peahen's call, or her gait like a dancing peacock in monsoon. The male peacock was believed to be so overcome by the scent of rain that he'd fan out his feathers in ecstatic display. A metaphor for male arousal so obvious you almost have to applaud the restraint of ancient poets. And let's not forget, Krishna, the god of divine romance, wears a peacock feather in his crown. Coincidence? Absolutely not. The feather represented playful beauty, seasonal passion, and spiritual sensuality all at once. In temple carvings, peacocks are often seen beside loving couples or hovering near scenes of amorous delight, as if to say, "Yup, it's happening. Don't mind me." Now slither into the world of the snake or naga, which had a much more layered reputation. In Indian mythology, snakes represent kundalini energy, that coiled serpent at the base of your spine that, when awakened through meditation or, yes, sex, rises upward through the chakras to unleash enlightenment. So, while in the West a snake might be a symbol of temptation or sin, in India it was often a symbol of hidden power, untapped potential, and sacred energy. In erotic art, a snake coiled around a couple might represent the fusion of the physical and spiritual, or simply the rising heat of pleasure. Either way, not your average garden pest. Historical fact for tonight. In ancient tantric diagrams and temple frescoes, serpents are frequently shown with their hoods flared behind female figures, signifying both protection and erotic energy. In some regions, couples would pray to snake deities like Manasa or Vasuki to help with fertility and sexual harmony. These weren't just idle superstitions. They were part of a broader belief that sex and the natural world were mirrors of each other, echoing the same rhythms and energies. Fringe fact: there's an obscure tradition in some parts of South India where newlywed couples used to receive small metal snake charms to place under their pillows during their first night together. It was believed to enhance kundalini flow and ward off shyness, and if you're imagining two nervous people lying stiffly with a tiny snake statue under their heads, you're not alone. Now swing your attention over to the elephant. Yes, really. The elephant wasn't just about power or memory. In erotic literature, it symbolized strength, endurance, and a certain, let's say, hefty masculinity. Vatsyayana, in the Kama Sutra, even includes a classification of men based on animals. The elephant-type man was considered slow, large, but powerful, a good match for women of a certain lotus-like temperament. There's an entire subsection on compatible pairings, elephant men with mare women, bull men with doe women, and so on. It's less zoology and more sexual astrology, but hey, they took it seriously. And yes, scholars have debated whether these animal-based metaphors were literal instructions or just poetic fun. Some argue they were part of an oral tradition meant to make sex education more memorable. After all, who forgets a lesson about bulls and does? Others think these classifications were gently coded ways to talk about anatomy, energy, and personality traits, in a world that didn't use clinical language but wasn't afraid of metaphor. Now picture a temple wall at Konark or Khajuraho, a couple carved in stone mid-embrace, their limbs delicately intertwined. Nearby, an elephant watches, or maybe walks past with a bemused look, like an auntie pretending she didn't see anything. Below them, a snake slithers up the side panel, and a peacock perches above with a flare of feathers. The message? This isn't just a moment of human passion. It's a moment within nature, part of the larger flow, where humans don't dominate the world, but echo it. Animal symbolism also shaped courtship. In love poetry, A woman's glance might be likened to the cautious curiosity of a deer, her movements to the playful dance of a monkey, her voice soft like the coo of a dove. A man might be described as a roaring lion or a persistent bee hovering around the flower of her lips. It's not subtle, but it is vivid and deeply connected to the world around them. Nature wasn't something separate from desire. It was desire wrapped in fur, scale, and feather. Even erotic dreams were often described with animal metaphors. Dreaming of riding a tiger or being chased by a swan wasn't just weird. It could be interpreted, usually by a priest or healer, as a sign of rising passion, fertility, or an upcoming romantic entanglement. They had entire manuals for dream analysis, and animals always stole the show. So as you drift off tonight, imagine a world where your desires weren't locked behind closed doors but danced in rhythm with birds, beasts, and rivers, where the rising of a cobra could symbolize spiritual awakening and physical arousal, where peacocks didn't just scream in the rain, they heralded love. Because in ancient India nothing was separate. The snake was sacred, the peacock was poetry, and the elephant, well, he might have just been the original symbol of stamina. Tonight we head to the shelves of the strange, where the potions fizz, the powders tingle, and the tools, well, let's just say the ancients weren't afraid to get creative. Because while the Kama Sutra and its literary siblings offered plenty of advice on timing, mood, and posture, there was another whole layer to ancient Indian bedroom life. Tantric tools, magical herbs, and handcrafted aids that pushed pleasure and maybe credibility to its limits. Some were rooted in deep Ayurvedic wisdom, others more trial and error, with a dash of wishful thinking and a sprinkle of moonlight. Let's begin with the potions. In Sanskrit texts, these are known as Vajikarana dravyas, or aphrodisiacs, and the recipes are wildly specific. You've got powders made from powdered banyan bark, goat testicles dried in ghee, crushed pearls mixed with honey, and boiled roots stirred with gold leaf. Yes, real gold. Why? Because gold was believed to carry the essence of the sun, pure vitality and fire. Swallowing it, in microscopic amounts, was supposed to light up your internal engine. Whether it worked or just gave you a really expensive stomachache is still up for debate. Historical fact of the night. The Karaka Samhita, our trusty Ayurvedic guide, doesn't just mention aphrodisiacs, it devotes entire chapters to them. Some were meant to increase desire, others to prolong performance, and a few claimed to revive the body after repeated unions, which we'll interpret generously as hangover cure for over-enthusiastic knights. These weren't fringe remedies either. Kings, warriors, even monks seeking to redirect or suppress desire used these blends. Sexual energy was powerful. Too much, and it burned you out. Too little, and it withered the soul. The potions aimed to strike a mythical middle. Then there were ritual enhancements, things you didn't drink or eat, but applied. Oils infused with jasmine, saffron or sandalwood were used for massaging the body before lovemaking, not just for pleasure, but to awaken the prana or life force in each limb. Some oils were spiked with herbs meant to heat or cool specific zones depending on your dosha. Cooling oils for fiery pitta types, warming oils for earthy kaphas, and neutral balancers for flighty vatas. Personalised foreplay brought to you by 5th century chemistry. And now for your fringe fact. The Anangaranga includes a section on crafting herbal pastes that, when applied to the lips, were said to intensify kissing to unbearable sweetness. Another recipe suggests boiling betel leaves in milk, letting them dry under moonlight, and then slipping them between the lips during foreplay. The effect? Tingling, cooling, slight euphoria, the original breath mint meets edible massage oil combo. But let's talk tools. Yes, they existed, though they weren't labelled and shelved in sleek packaging. Ancient texts and temple carvings reference a variety of objects used for stimulation or enhancement. These included phallic-shaped objects carved from stone, ivory or even clay, often used by courtesans or women living in celibacy. The Kama Sutra casually mentions women practicing upon a pillar or roll of cloth, and there are poems from as early as the 8th century describing a lonely woman speaking to her Shilalinga, or stone lover. Were these tools always erotic? Not necessarily. Some were tied to fertility rituals or spiritual practices, especially in tantric sects where objects representing male and female energy, the linga and yoni, were used in meditative rituals. But in many cases, function met form. Tools weren't just symbolic. They were used, quietly, carefully, and one imagines with considerable creativity. Then there were amulets and charms, small discreet items worn on the body, sometimes around the neck, sometimes elsewhere. Some were engraved with yantras, geometric spiritual designs, others infused with mantras, and all were believed to either enhance desire, protect from performance issues, or attract a specific lover. One ancient spell involves chanting a verse while tying a thread soaked in rose oil around the wrist of the beloved. Do it right, and they'll fall into your arms. Do it wrong, and, well, you just smell like roses with rejection issues. Scholars continue to debate how widespread these practices were. Were they elite experiments, reserved for royal bedrooms and highly trained courtesans? Or did knowledge of potions and tools trickle down through the hands of midwives, folk healers, and curious teenagers? Evidence suggests both. The fancy recipes with pearls and gold were likely luxury items. But the neem-based oils, the flower-infused bath powders, those could be, and still are, made in a village kitchen. And let's not forget, not all tools were physical, some were psychological. Ancient Indian lovers were advised to use play-acting, mimicry, and even light teasing as part of foreplay. Disguises were encouraged. One partner might dress as a sage, the other as a celestial nymph. They would play out a little skit before getting to the main act. Not because they needed fantasy to cover shame, but because it added rasa, flavour to the experience. Desire, they believed, lived not just in the body, but in the imagination. Now picture a chamber deep within a stone palace. Silk drapes flutter in the candlelight. A tray sits nearby filled with tiny clay pots, each holding a different oil, powder, or paste. A book lies open to a verse about kissing under moonlight. A lover applies a dab of sandalwood to their partner's chest, tracing a mantra into the skin. No urgency, just ritual, just slow exploration with eyes and hands and hearts. Or imagine a courtesan preparing herself. She applies her lip paste, fastens a charm under her sash, lights incense and recites a mantra not for protection but for pleasure. She knows her tools, she knows her craft. She's the alchemist of affection, the herbalist of heat. So as your thoughts grow soft and the hum of sleep beckons, remember this. Pleasure has always been part science, part story, part superstition. The ancients knew that touch alone is wonderful, but touch, enhanced with intention, scent, sound, texture, that's where magic lives. And maybe you don't need powdered gold tonight. Maybe all you need is a little attention, a little breath, a small ritual just for you. Because the oldest tool of all is time, and tonight you have all of it. Tonight the mood shifts, the incense fades, the velvet of ancient comfort begins to fray. We're stepping into the part of the story where things start to disappear, not slowly, but deliberately. Because as much as ancient India once embraced sexuality as sacred somewhere along the road, that light dimmed. What was once painted in temple walls, sung in evening verse, and taught with gentle guidance became something else, something suspicious, hidden, and in many cases outright condemned. This is the story of how open sexuality declined in India, and how centuries of invasions, politics and reform turned joy into shame. Let's set the stage. For over 1,000 years, from the early Vedic period to the height of temple culture, India celebrated sexuality as part of Dharma, not in opposition to it. Kama was one of the four main aims of life, and art, literature, architecture and spiritual practice reflected this. But from the late first millennium onward, things began to shift. The first major waves came with foreign invasions, particularly Islamic rulers from Central Asia and Persia, who brought with them very different social codes around the body, modesty, and morality. Now let's be clear, not every Muslim ruler imposed puritanical rules. In fact, many Persian traditions had their own rich appreciation for sensuality. Erotic poetry flourished in the Mughal courts. Love stories like Layla Majnun and Heer Ranjha were adapted into Indian versions. But with political control came religious conservatism. Temples were sacked, erotic sculptures were defaced, whole schools of Tantra went underground. Khajuraho, that famously explicit city of stone love, was swallowed by jungle for centuries. Not because nature hid it, but because society chose to forget. A historical fact to anchor tonight. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the arrival of Islamic dynasties led to shifts in cultural expression. Courtesans lost their state support. Public performance of erotic art was frowned upon or outright banned. Temple dancers became vulnerable, once honoured, now accused of obscenity. Many were forced into secrecy or poverty. The sensual world didn't vanish, it went into hiding. Meanwhile, a different kind of resistance was brewing from within. Certain Hindu reform movements, especially Bhakti sects, began emphasizing spiritual devotion over ritual and bodily experience. Some of them still used the language of romantic longing, Radha Krishna being the obvious example, but the body itself became symbolic, not sensual. Desire was reimagined as divine yearning, not actual union. The message was no longer honour desire, but transcend it. And this shift only deepened with time. Scholars still debate how much of this transformation was reactive. Did Hindu thinkers double down on modesty to protect their culture from colonial or Islamic judgment? Or was it a natural evolution towards spiritual interiority? Either way, the result was the same. Open conversations about pleasure began to vanish from public life. Even the Kama Sutra, once read aloud in courtly salons, was quietly shelved or recopied in secrecy. Now comes the real gut punch, colonialism. When the British arrived in the 18th century, they weren't just here to trade, they came to civilise in their own eyes. Victorian England was a place where table legs were sometimes covered for modesty. Imagine how they reacted to temples filled with intertwined lovers, manuals discussing cunnilingus with botanical metaphors, and courtesans performing dances that celebrated seduction. The horror. Fringe fact for the night. In 1864, Sir Richard Burton published an English translation of the Kama Sutra, but it had to be printed privately in secret and disguised as a scholarly document. Public distribution of erotic texts was illegal under British law. In India, British officers and missionaries condemned Indian sexuality as primitive and immoral. The art was hidden. The stories were sanitized. In schools, Kama, the ancient pillar of human purpose, was scrubbed from the syllabus. This wasn't just censorship, it was cultural gaslighting. Entire generations grew up thinking that modesty, prudishness, and sexual ignorance were part of Indian tradition, when in fact they were imports, overlaid like a foreign script on an ancient manuscript, smudging the original meaning, and it worked. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Indian elite, especially those educated in British schools, began internalising Victorian morality. Leaders of the independence movement, many of whom were Western educated, started framing sexuality as a distraction. Even Gandhi, for all his spiritual wisdom, preached celibacy as a virtue, not just for monks but for married couples. He tested his own restraint in famously uncomfortable ways, like sleeping beside young women to test his detachment. Spoiler, it didn't help the cultural mood, so what happened to the sacred sensuality of India? It didn't die, but it went underground. Erotic sculptures were labelled art instead of education. Devadasis were rebranded as immoral and banned from temples. Courtesans were left to fade into poverty. And the conversations that once happened openly, about touch, timing, scent, mood, got replaced by awkward silences, euphemisms, and shame. Imagine now a child growing up in the 1950s staring at a stone sculpture of lovers on a temple wall. She asks her grandmother, "Who are they?" And the grandmother, uncomfortable, says, "They're just dancing." The child knows that's not true, but the truth has been folded, packed away, buried beneath generations of disapproval. The whisper of karma, once loud as thunder, becomes barely a murmur. Scholars and artists today are working to rediscover that voice, to remind people that pleasure was once sacred, not scandalous. That India's roots aren't prudish, they're poetic, earthy, alive. But the recovery is slow. The damage of shame runs deep. We carry it even now, not as law, but as reflex. So as your thoughts drift tonight toward quieter places, let yourself grieve a little, for what was lost, for what was hidden, for all the lovers, dancers, and poets whose words were silenced. But also remember, stone remembers. The carvings still stand, the scrolls still whisper, and within you, yes, you, is a memory older than repression, a rhythm older than rule, and it's still humming, waiting to be heard again. Tonight, we follow the thread even deeper, into the colder shadows of colonial history, where not only desire but identity itself was pried apart. If the Islamic invasions began dimming the flame of open sexuality in India, it was the long grip of British colonial rule that built the cage and slammed the door. This isn't just a story of censorship, it's one of systematic cultural erasure, of rewriting an entire civilization's relationship to pleasure, gender, and the body. It's not a fun story, but it's one we need to tell. Let's rewind to the 18th and 19th centuries, when British colonists weren't just seizing land, they were also inspecting souls. They arrived with powdered wigs, tight waistcoats, and Victorian moral codes so repressive they made temple dances look like pagan chaos. To them, Indian art, literature, and spiritual life were a confusing mess of sensuality and idolatry. And because they didn't understand it, they did what colonizers always do. They labelled it dangerous, depraved, and inferior. Take the temples of Khajuraho and Konark, for example. The same stone carvings that once whispered the cosmic unity of love and form were suddenly called obscene. British officers wrote formal letters of protest about these indecent images. Some demanded they be defaced or hidden from public view. A few temples were boarded up entirely. What had once been sacred was now shameful, because the people in charge decided it was. Historical fact to rattle your dreams. In 1860, the British codified Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, a law that criminalised carnal intercourse against the order of nature, which in their eyes meant any sex that wasn't heteronormative, missionary style, and baby-making. This single piece of legislation, imported wholesale from British legal tradition, would go on to silence queerness in India for over 150 years. Same-sex relationships, which had been acknowledged, even celebrated in earlier texts, were suddenly made punishable by law. Not based on Indian belief, but on British anxiety. And they didn't stop at the bedroom. They went after the Devadasis, the temple dancers we met earlier. Under colonial reform campaigns led by British missionaries and Indian elites eager to impress them, the entire Devadasi system was reframed as immoral. Temple dance was no longer seen as sacred. It was painted as prostitution. Within a few decades, girls who once danced for the gods were being forcibly removed from temples, their traditions outlawed, their lineages broken. It gets worse. Entire schools of Tantra were branded black magic. Erotic literature was deemed pornographic. The Kama Sutra, when it finally appeared in English, was stripped of its context and sold like an exotic manual for elite European men. Imagine your most sacred family cookbook being reduced to a novelty item in a foreign gift shop, and you're getting close. Here's your fringe fact tonight. By the early 20th century, the British were so freaked out by Indian sexuality that colonial police would raid private homes under obscenity laws. People could be arrested for owning texts that mentioned sex, even if those texts were over 1,000 years old and rooted in spiritual tradition. The shame was now institutional. Educated Indians were taught to be embarrassed by their past, and yet, the legacy stuck. Even after independence in 1947, the cultural hangover of colonial shame didn't vanish overnight. In fact, some of India's first leaders, including Nehru and Gandhi, carried forward the idea that desire should be controlled, even repressed, in order to build a modern nation. Cinema was censored. Erotic art remained in storage. Sexual education was non-existent. You could speak of karma, but only as metaphor, never as flesh. Debates among scholars continue. Some argue that the British simply magnified a conservative undercurrent already present in Indian society. Others insist that Victorian morality was a cultural toxin introduced from the outside, and that the shame we now associate with sexuality was never truly native. Either way, the damage ran deep, and yet, there were cracks in the walls. Indian artists, dancers, writers, and scholars began to push back. In the 1960s and 70s, poets rediscovered lost verses. Classical dancers revived ancient sensual choreography. Historians began translating erotic texts with context, reclaiming the dignity and nuance of traditions once dismissed. Even the Devadasi legacy found defenders, those who fought to preserve their dance as sacred, not scandalous. Imagine a young woman in post-independence India stumbling across a faded palm leaf manuscript in her grandfather's library. It's the Anangaranga, long forgotten, She reads it in secret, heart pounding, not with lust, but with recognition. This, she thinks, isn't dirty, it's beautiful. And slowly, she begins to question everything she's been taught about her culture, her body, her voice, or picture a gay man in the 1990s living under Section 377, knowing his desires are criminalised. He visits a temple and sees for the first time a sculpture of two male figures entwined in an embrace. It's carved in stone, centuries old, and suddenly he doesn't feel alone. He feels seen. This is how cultures reclaim themselves, not through violence, through memory. So as you lie back tonight and let your thoughts settle, ask yourself this. What stories have you been told about your body? About desire? About what's sacred and what's shameful? And are those stories yours? Or did someone, somewhere, centuries ago, write them for you? Because the truth is still here, carved into pillars, hidden in poems, trapped in temple walls that watched it all happen. The colonizers may have tried to erase it, but stone doesn't forget, and neither should we. Tonight, we trace the final arc of this journey, the long echo of ancient openness that still hums beneath the noise of modern India. Because despite centuries of suppression, shame, and strategic forgetting, the memory of sacred sensuality never completely disappeared. It survived in symbols, in whispers, in half-remembered songs. And now, as the tide of silence begins to shift once more, you can still feel its pulse. Ancient India isn't gone. It's just waiting, beneath the layers of fabric. The noise of headlines, the awkward schoolbooks that skip entire chapters. Kama is not dead. It's just learning how to speak again. Let's begin in the cities. In Mumbai, Delhi, Bengaluru, places bursting with contradiction. You have ultra-conservative laws and ultra-bold content living side by side. One block may have a temple priest warning of moral decline, and the next. A cafe hosting poetry slams where young women read verses about longing and touch, voice trembling but proud. Instagram pages dedicated to reinterpreting the Kama Sutra pop up with stylized artwork and bite-sized breakdowns. Erotic sculpture is making its way back into museums, and Indian writers, especially women and queer writers, are reclaiming the narrative, one sentence at a time. Take the recent legal battles around Section 377, that colonial-era law we met last night. For decades, it criminalised same-sex relationships. But in 2018, after relentless activism and storytelling by queer Indians, the Supreme Court finally struck it down. The ruling didn't just change law, it began to heal history. In the courtroom, judges quoted ancient Indian texts that acknowledged and even celebrated diverse expressions of love and gender. It was more than a legal win, it was a return. Here's your historical fact for tonight. In the final judgment overturning 377, the court acknowledged that the right to love was a constitutional right, and cited ancient Hindu and Buddhist texts as evidence that Indian culture had never been inherently homophobic. That was the moment many realised the truth. It wasn't our past that was the problem, it was the interruption. Now, in schools and universities, students are asking new questions. Why don't we learn about karma as one of the 4 pillars of life anymore? Why did we reduce the Kama Sutra to cartoonish sex positions and remove its chapters on emotional compatibility, consent and beauty rituals? Why is love still taught with red ink and blacked out diagrams? Fringe fact. In the 2020s, a group of Indian academics launched an online archive called the Erotic Epics Project, dedicated to compiling, translating and analysing ancient texts on love, desire and body politics. It includes obscure tantric manuals, forgotten verses from the Puranas, and oral histories from rural storytellers who kept the tales alive when books could not. One of the researchers joked, "We're not perverts, we're historians, very, very passionate historians, and rural India, it's not all innocent blushes and old-fashioned shame. In villages across Tamil Nadu, Odisha and Bengal, erotic folk art still appears on wedding cards, festival banners, and even mud walls. In some tribal communities, explicit carvings on household objects are used to bless fertility. And in certain temples, lovers still offer milk, flowers and poems to Radha and Krishna, not as gods of celibacy, but as eternal partners in playful, overwhelming desire. But modern India also lives in tension. On one side, you have a digital generation curious, bold, and ready to unlearn. On the other, rising waves of moral policing, censorship, and political control over art, education, and even personal relationships. Films with intimate scenes are often edited. Sex education is either banned or sanitized beyond recognition. LGBTQ+ people, despite legal protection, still face cultural backlash, and women who speak openly about desire, still judged harshly. So where does that leave us? Maybe right where we started, at the threshold. Ancient India didn't see sex as shameful, it saw it as powerful. Dangerous, yes. Transformative, absolutely. But not dirty, not sinful. That was the lie layered over centuries. What we're seeing now is a slow awakening, a pulling back of the curtain. Not a return to the past, but a reimagining of it. Not to copy it, but to learn from it. Imagine a college classroom where a professor reads aloud a love poem from 200 years ago, and students giggle, not because it's silly, but because it's familiar. Because it sounds like something they felt but couldn't say. Imagine a queer teenager standing before a temple carving of two male figures and realizing this wasn't just tolerated once, it was normal, sacred, even. Or imagine a young woman reading a translation of the Kama Sutra that doesn't skip the parts about her pleasure, her needs, her voice, and for the first time she doesn't feel wrong. She feels written into the story. That's what's changing. Not just the conversation, but who gets to speak. The courtesans who were erased, the lovers who were jailed, the dancers who were silenced, they're all slowly returning, through art, through archives, through memory. So tonight, as you rest, know this. Your desire is not a deviation. It is a continuation of a lineage that predates shame. You carry within you echoes of every lover, every poet, every temple sculptor who ever dared to believe that the body is not a cage, but a doorway. And maybe, just maybe, as more people awaken to that truth, we can finally stop asking if sex was sacred in ancient India and start asking how to make it sacred again. Because the story doesn't end here. It ends every night we forget, and begins every time we remember, and now we exhale. We've wandered through palaces and temples, down winding scrolls and whispered poems, across centuries of celebration and suppression, all to reach this soft place, the edge of sleep and the edge of memory. If you've made it this far, if you've followed the trail of carved stone, sandalwood oil, and footnotes from forgotten manuscripts, then you already know. This was never just a history of sex. It was a history of how we relate to ourselves, to our bodies, our desires, and the people we choose to love. Ancient India didn't get everything right. Let's not romanticize. There were taboos, inequalities, rules stacked like bricks between hearts that wanted to connect. But there was also wonder, curiosity, an acceptance of longing as part of the life. Not something to silence or banish, but something to understand, guide, and honour. They built temples to it, wrote songs for it, prayed through it. That matters. And now, in this moment, whatever hour it is where you are, whatever city or quiet little corner you're lying in, you get to choose what you carry forward. Maybe it's the idea that touch is sacred, that pleasure is worthy of care, that your wants aren't embarrassing, they're human, that sex is not a stain on the spirit but sometimes the mirror of it. So, dim the last light. Let the echoes of ancient drums and lovers' laughter fade into the night. Somewhere, incense is still burning. Somewhere, a sculpture still smiles in stone. And here you are, soft, warm, full of stories. Let yourself drift. Let yourself remember. Let yourself be whole.